You've been taught to fear what leaves your life. They told you that when something disappears, it means something is missing, that every ending is a loss, every distance is rejection, every empty space is something to fill quickly. But if that were true, why does your heart sometimes feel lighter after something is gone? Why does silence begin to feel calmer when the noise fades? Why does peace start to appear only after certain people, paths, and attachments leave? The truth is, what leaves your life is not always taking something away. It is making room for peace. It is clearing what no longer fits who you are becoming. It is removing what your mind was too afraid to release. And Buddhist wisdom has always pointed to this quiet truth. For centuries, the deepest teachings on detachment have shown that suffering is not in the leaving. It is in the holding on, in the resistance, in the fear of emptiness. Tonight, as you listen to these lessons, something will shift. Your mind will begin to loosen its grip. The weight you have been carrying will slowly fall away. You will start to see that every departure has a purpose. Every ending creates space. And in that space, something gentle begins to grow. Something you have been searching for without realizing it. Peace. This is not just another audio to fall asleep to. This is a quiet clearing happening within you. Are you ready? Let's begin. Something inside you has already begun to understand. Not loudly, not clearly, but quietly. You can feel it in the moments where you stop chasing, in the pauses where you no longer have the energy to force what once felt so important, in the subtle shift where certain things don't excite you the way they used to. That is where this begins, because before you can understand why things leave, you have to notice that they were already fading. And now we step into that space. There is a kind of ending that does not ask for attention. No final argument, no dramatic goodbye, no moment where everything suddenly breaks apart. Just a slow, almost invisible drifting. Until one day you realize something is no longer there the way it used to be. And what makes this kind of ending so difficult is not the loss itself. It is the silence. The mind searches for something to hold on to, a reason, an explanation, a clear moment where it can say, this is when it ended. But there is no clear line, only a gradual fading. At first it feels confusing. You question yourself. You wonder if you're imagining it. You try to go back to how things were, to bring back the feeling that once existed. But something has already changed. And no matter how much you try to recreate it, it doesn't feel the same. This is the silent exit of what no longer resonates. It doesn't happen because something is broken. It happens because something is no longer aligned. Alignment is something the mind struggles to understand because it cannot always be explained with logic. There are moments where everything looks fine on the outside. The person is still there. The situation still exists. Nothing has visibly fallen apart. But internally, something no longer fits. It feels like wearing clothes that once fit perfectly, but now feel tight in ways you cannot ignore. There is no damage to the clothes, but they no longer belong to who you are now. And instead of recognizing this, the mind tries to adjust itself to fit what is no longer meant for it. It tries harder. It explains more. It gives more energy than before, because it believes that effort can fix misalignment. But misalignment is not something you fix. It is something you notice and allow. There is a deep fear that arises when something begins to fade without conflict, because conflict gives closure. It gives a clear reason. It allows the mind to say, this is why it ended. But when something simply drifts away, there is no one to blame. And without blame, the ego feels lost. It does not know where to place the weight of the ending, so it turns inward. It starts asking questions that have no clear answers. Did I do something wrong? Could I have stopped this? Why did this happen without warning? But the truth is, there was warning. Not loud, not obvious, but present. In the way conversations became shorter, in the way effort started to feel heavier, in the way something that once felt natural began to feel forced. These are the quiet signals of misalignment, but they are easy to ignore because they do not demand attention. And the mind prefers loud endings because they are easier to understand. But life does not always end things loudly. Sometimes it removes them gently, almost as if it knows that a sudden break would create more resistance. So instead, it softens the exit. It allows the connection to loosen slowly. It allows the attachment to weaken over time. It allows you to adjust without realizing it is happening. And yet, even with this gentleness, there is still resistance, because the mind does not like losing what is familiar, even if the familiar no longer brings peace. There is something deeply rooted in human nature that clings to what is known. Familiar discomfort feels safer than unfamiliar freedom. So when something begins to leave, the instinct is to hold on tighter, to reach out more, to fix what was never meant to be fixed, to revive what is already dissolving. But this only creates tension, because you are trying to keep something in your life that has already begun to move out of alignment with you. And the more you force it, the heavier it becomes. This is where suffering begins, not in the leaving itself, but in the refusal to let it leave. There is a difference between something being taken from you and something completing its place in your life. But the mind does not easily see that difference. It sees absence and labels it as loss. It sees distance and calls it rejection. It sees change and interprets it as something going wrong. But what if nothing is going wrong? What if something is simply ending naturally? There is a quiet intelligence in life that does not always explain itself. It moves things in and out of your experience without needing your approval. Not to harm you, but to shape you, to guide you towards something that requires a different version of you. And that version cannot exist while you are still holding on to what no longer resonates. This is why things fade, not because you failed, but because you evolved. Growth is not always visible. You do not always notice when your perspective changes. You do not always realize when your energy shifts. But it happens. And when it does, your life begins to reorganize itself around that change. People who once felt aligned begin to feel distant. Paths that once excited you begin to feel empty. Goals that once defined you lose their meaning. And it can feel unsettling, because it creates a gap between who you were and who you are becoming. And in that gap, things begin to fall away. But this falling away is not destruction, it is refinement. It is life removing what no longer matches your direction. The difficulty is that the mind wants to understand everything immediately. It wants clarity before acceptance. But life does not always give clarity first. Sometimes it asks for trust before understanding, to allow something to leave without knowing exactly why, to sit with the absence without rushing to fill it, to accept that not everything that ends needs to be explained. And this is where peace begins to form, not when everything stays the same, but when you stop resisting what is changing. There is a lightness that comes when you allow things to exit without force, when you stop chasing what is already moving away, when you stop trying to revive what has naturally gone quiet, because chasing creates noise, and noise blocks peace. But when you allow the silence, something shifts. The mind begins to settle. The need for control starts to loosen. The constant tension of holding on begins to dissolve. And in that space, you begin to feel something unfamiliar. Not excitement, not intensity, but calm. A calm that does not depend on anything staying. A calm that exists even as things leave. This is the kind of peace that detachment brings, not a cold distance from life, but a deep acceptance of its movement. You begin to understand that not everything is meant to stay, that some things are temporary by design, that their purpose is not to last forever, but to exist for a time, and then leave when that time is complete. And when you stop trying to extend what has already reached its end, you stop exhausting yourself. You stop carrying what no longer needs to be carried. You stop holding on to something that has already let go of you. There is a quiet dignity in allowing things to leave without resistance, in not needing a final explanation, in not demanding closure, in not forcing one more conversation just to feel complete. Because true completion does not always come from answers. Sometimes it comes from acceptance, from recognizing that something has already ended, even if it was never clearly announced. And once you see that, something inside you begins to relax. You no longer feel the need to chase every fading connection. You no longer feel the urge to fix every drifting situation. You begin to trust the natural rhythm of life, the way things come and the way they go, without needing to control either. And in that trust, there is freedom. A freedom that is not loud or dramatic, but quiet, stable, unshaken by the constant movement of people, circumstances, and time. Because you finally understand something that changes everything. What leaves your life is not always a loss. Sometimes it is life creating space, space for clarity, space for growth, space for peace. And the moment you stop resisting that space is the moment you begin to feel what you have been searching for all along. Not in what stays, but in what you no longer need to hold. And as that space begins to open, something unexpected rises to the surface. Not relief, not clarity, but a quiet kind of sadness. Because when things leave your life, it is not only people, places, or situations that disappear. Sometimes it is a version of you, the one you spent years building, the one you believed you would become, the one you held on to as your future. And now it no longer fits. There is a grief that no one prepares you for, not the grief of losing something outside of you, but the grief of losing who you thought you would be. It does not come with rituals. No one gathers around you, no one tells you how to process it, because from the outside, nothing seems wrong. But inside, something has quietly ended. A dream you once carried begins to fade. An identity you once held tightly no longer feels true. A future you imagined with so much certainty starts to dissolve without asking for your permission. And the strange part is, you are the one letting it go. No one forced it out of your hands. No one took it away from you. You simply reached a point where you could no longer pretend it still belonged to you. And that realization is heavy, because identity is not something small. It is how you see yourself. It is how you understand your place in the world. It is the story you tell yourself about who you are becoming. So when that story begins to change, it feels like losing a part of yourself. You may not say it out loud. You may not even fully admit it to yourself, but there is a quiet mourning happening beneath the surface. A mourning for the life you thought you would live, a mourning for the person you believed you would become. This kind of grief is confusing because nothing physically died, yet something is gone. The mind struggles with this. It tries to hold on to the old version of you. It replays past ambitions. It reminds you of the goals you once set, as if repeating them will bring them back to life. But something inside you already knows that version of you is no longer aligned with who you are now. And this is where the conflict begins, between what you once believed and what you are now starting to see. You may find yourself asking questions that have no simple answers. Was I wrong back then? Did I waste time chasing something that was never meant for me? Who am I now if I am not that person anymore? These questions are not just thoughts, they are the mind trying to protect a familiar identity. Because letting go of who you thought you would be feels like stepping into the unknown without a map. And the unknown is uncomfortable. Even if what you are leaving behind no longer brings you peace, at least it was familiar. You knew how to exist within it. You knew how to explain it to others. You knew how to define yourself through it. But now, that definition is dissolving, and what replaces it is not immediately clear. There is a space where certainty used to be, and in that space, there is silence. This is where many people rush to fill the gap. They try to quickly replace the old identity with a new one. They search for something else to become. They cling to new labels, new goals, new directions, just to avoid feeling undefined. But this only creates another attachment, another version of the self that may not truly align, because the mind is not trying to grow, it is trying to escape the discomfort of not knowing. But growth does not come from rushing into a new identity. It comes from sitting with the absence of the old one, allowing yourself to exist without immediately defining who you are. This is not easy because identity gives a sense of control. It allows you to say, "This is who I am," and when that certainty fades, it can feel like you are losing control of yourself. But in truth, you are not losing yourself. You are shedding a version of yourself that no longer fits. And shedding is not destruction, it is transformation. But transformation is rarely comfortable. It involves letting go of things that once felt important, dreams that once motivated you, paths that once defined your direction, versions of yourself that once felt like the final destination, and accepting that they are no longer part of your journey. There is a quiet courage required to do this because it means facing the possibility that you have changed, not in a way that can be easily explained, but in a way that can be deeply felt. You start to notice it in small moments. Things that once excited you no longer do. Conversations that once felt meaningful now feel empty. Goals that once seemed urgent now feel distant. And instead of forcing yourself to feel the same way again, you begin to accept that something inside you has shifted. This acceptance is where healing begins, not in trying to go back, but in allowing yourself to move forward without carrying what no longer belongs. Grieving an old identity does not mean something went wrong. It means something has changed. And change is not always something to fix. Sometimes it is something to honor, to recognize that the person you once were was necessary for you to become who you are now, even if you no longer resonate with that version of yourself. There is no need to reject your past, no need to judge who you used to be. That version of you served a purpose. It carried you through certain experiences. It helped you learn certain lessons. It shaped your understanding of the world. But it was never meant to be permanent. And holding on to it prevents you from fully stepping into who you are becoming. This is where detachment becomes important. Not detachment from life, but detachment from fixed identities, from the need to always know exactly who you are. Because the truth is, you are not a fixed identity. You are a process, a continuous unfolding. And each version of you is temporary. Some will stay longer than others. Some will leave quietly without announcement. But none of them are meant to define you forever. And once you begin to understand this, the fear of losing yourself starts to fade. Because you realize you are not losing yourself, you are simply not the same person anymore. And that is not something to mourn endlessly, it is something to respect. There is a certain peace that comes from no longer needing to hold on to a specific version of who you should be, from allowing yourself to change without resistance, from letting go of identities that feel heavy instead of forcing yourself to carry them. And in that letting go, you begin to feel lighter, not because you have found a new identity, but because you are no longer trapped in an old one. This is where freedom begins, in the space between who you were and who you are becoming. A space that does not need to be rushed, a space that does not need to be filled immediately, a space where you can simply exist without needing to define yourself. And in that space, something quiet begins to grow, not a new identity to cling to, but a deeper awareness of yourself, one that is not based on labels, not based on expectations, not based on who you thought you had to be, but based on something more real, something that does not need to be forced, something that simply is. And when you allow yourself to stay in that space without rushing, without resisting, you begin to see that letting go of who you thought you would be was not the end of your identity. It was the beginning of your truth. And as that new awareness begins to take shape, something even more uncomfortable reveals itself. Not just what you have been holding on to, but why you have been holding on for so long. Because even after you begin to outgrow certain versions of yourself, even after you feel that quiet shift pulling you in a different direction, there is still something inside you that resists letting go completely. It is not always love, it is not always purpose, and it is not always meaning. Sometimes it is something much simpler and much harder to admit. It is familiarity. There is a strange comfort in what you already know, even when what you know hurts you. A quiet pull that keeps you returning to the same patterns, the same thoughts, the same emotional cycles, even when you have already seen where they lead. And this is where the next layer begins to unfold. There is a kind of pain that feels almost like home. Not because it is good, not because it is fulfilling, but because it is known. You recognize it, you understand its rhythm, you know how it begins, how it grows, and how it ends. And in a strange way, that predictability creates a sense of safety. The mind does not always choose what is best. It chooses what is familiar. And when something has been repeated enough times, even if it causes suffering, it becomes part of your internal landscape. It becomes something you can navigate without thinking. You know how to respond, how to react, how to survive within it. And that sense of knowing creates a false sense of control. This is why people return to situations that have already hurt them. This is why old emotional wounds keep reopening. This is why certain patterns repeat, even when you are aware of them. Because awareness alone is not enough to break attachment. There is something deeper that keeps pulling you back. The mind fears what it cannot predict. It prefers a pain it understands over a peace it does not. Because peace, when it is unfamiliar, feels empty. It feels uncertain. It feels like standing in a space where nothing is happening, where there is no tension, no urgency, no emotional intensity. And to a mind that has been conditioned by constant stimulation, that stillness can feel unsettling. So instead of staying in that stillness, the mind creates movement. It replays old thoughts. It brings back memories. It revisits situations that have already ended. It searches for problems to solve, even when there are none, because activity feels safer than silence. There is a deep habit of suffering that forms over time, not because you want to suffer, but because you have learned how to exist within it. You have built responses around it. You have shaped your identity around it. And without it, there is a part of you that does not know who you are. This is why letting go of familiar pain is not just about releasing the pain itself. It is about releasing the identity that formed around it. It is about stepping away from the version of you that was shaped by those experiences. And that can feel like losing something, even when what you are losing is suffering. There is also a subtle attachment to emotional intensity. Pain, in many ways, feels alive. It creates movement. It demands attention. It gives the mind something to focus on. And when that intensity is gone, there can be a sense of emptiness, as if something is missing. But what is missing is not something you need. It is something you have become used to. There is a difference between what is necessary and what is familiar, and the mind often confuses the two. You may notice this in the way you hold on to certain thoughts. Thoughts that repeat without offering any solution. Thoughts that bring you back to the same emotional state over and over again. You know they are not helping you, but you continue to engage with them because they are known, because they feel like something you can hold on to. This is how attachment to pain is maintained, not through external circumstances alone, but through internal repetition. The mind becomes a loop, cycling through the same patterns, reinforcing the same feelings, keeping the same attachments alive. Breaking this cycle does not happen through force. You cannot fight the mind into letting go. That only creates more resistance. What is needed is something much quieter, something more patient. You begin by noticing, not reacting, not judging, just observing. Seeing the patterns without immediately following them. Recognizing the pull without giving in to it. This creates a small distance between you and the pattern, and in that distance, something changes. The more you observe, the more you begin to see that the pain you are holding on to is not as solid as it feels. It is not fixed. It is not permanent. It is a series of thoughts, sensations, and memories that come and go. But because you have been engaging with them for so long, they feel continuous. When you stop feeding that continuity, the pattern begins to weaken. Not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually. The intensity lessens, the urgency fades, the need to return to it becomes weaker. This is where unfamiliar peace begins to enter. And at first, it does not feel like peace. It feels like nothing. Like a quiet space where the usual noise is no longer present. And the mind, not knowing how to interpret this, may try to fill it again. But if you stay with it, if you allow that quiet to exist without trying to change it, something shifts. That emptiness begins to feel different. It becomes less uncomfortable, less threatening, and eventually it becomes something you can rest in. Peace is not something that needs to be created. It is something that is revealed when the noise of familiar pain is no longer dominating your attention. It has always been there, beneath the patterns, beneath the repetition, beneath the attachment. But to experience it, you have to allow the old patterns to dissolve. Not by forcing them away, but by no longer holding on to them. By recognizing that what feels familiar is not always what is right for you. There is a quiet strength in choosing not to return to what once defined you, in allowing yourself to step away from patterns that no longer serve you, in sitting with the discomfort of not knowing, rather than running back to what you already understand. Because what you understand has already shown you its limits. It has already revealed where it leads, and continuing to return to it will only repeat the same outcome. Letting go of familiar pain is not about rejecting your past. It is about no longer allowing it to control your present. It is about recognizing that just because something has been part of your life for a long time does not mean it needs to remain. And when you begin to release that attachment, something opens, not suddenly, not all at once, but gradually. A sense of lightness, a reduction in internal tension, a feeling that you are no longer carrying something you have been holding for too long. This is where real change begins. Not in dramatic moments, but in quiet decisions. In choosing not to engage with the same thought. In allowing a feeling to pass without holding on to it. In recognizing that you do not have to return to what is familiar just because it is known. And as you continue to make those choices, the attachment weakens. The patterns lose their hold. And what once felt like an unavoidable cycle becomes something you can step out of. This is the deeper layer of detachment, not just letting go of external things, but releasing the internal habits that keep you connected to suffering. seeing that the mind's attachment to pain is not a necessity, but a pattern. And patterns can change. It takes patience. It takes awareness. It takes a willingness to sit with what is unfamiliar. But in that unfamiliar space, something new begins to emerge, something that does not rely on repetition, something that does not depend on intensity, something quieter, something steadier, something that does not come from what you hold on to, but from what you finally allow to fall away. And as those patterns begin to loosen, something else becomes visible, something you could not clearly see while you were still holding on. It is not just that you were attached to familiar pain, it is that you were carrying more than you realized. Not only emotions, not only memories, but a quiet weight that slowly built over time, and because it was always there, you stopped noticing it. There is a moment that comes after letting go, where everything feels different, not because something new has arrived, but because something heavy is no longer present. And yet the mind does not immediately recognize this as relief. It interprets it as loss. There is a strange feeling that appears when something leaves, a hollow space, a pause, a silence that was not there before. And the mind reacts quickly. It says something is missing. It says something has been taken. It says you are now less than you were before. But what if that feeling is not loss? What if it is lightness that you have not yet learned how to recognize? There is a quiet misunderstanding in the way the mind perceives change. It has been trained to believe that having more means being complete, and losing something means becoming incomplete. So when something leaves, the immediate assumption is that you are now lacking something essential. But this assumption ignores something important. It ignores the weight of what you are holding. Not everything you carry is meant to stay with you. Some things were never meant to be permanent. They were meant to pass through your life, to teach you something, to shape your awareness, and then to leave when their purpose was complete. But instead of allowing them to leave, the mind holds on. It attaches meaning. It builds identity. It creates stories around them. And slowly, what was once temporary becomes something you feel you cannot live without. This is how invisible weight forms, not through physical burden, but through emotional attachment, through the constant effort of maintaining something that no longer aligns with who you are becoming. You may not notice it at first. It does not announce itself. It does not feel heavy in a way that is obvious. It blends into your daily experience. It becomes part of how you think, how you feel, how you move through life. But it is there, in the effort it takes to hold on to something that is already fading, in the tension that builds when you try to keep something from changing, in the quiet exhaustion that comes from carrying expectations that no longer fit. And because it has been there for so long, you begin to believe that this weight is normal, that this is just how life feels. So when something leaves, you do not immediately feel relief. You feel absence. You feel like something has been removed that you needed. But what has actually been removed is the weight you had grown used to carrying. This is why detachment can feel confusing at first. It does not always feel like freedom. It feels like emptiness. It feels like something is missing. And the mind, uncomfortable with that space, tries to fill it as quickly as possible. It looks for replacements. It revisits old attachments. It tries to bring back what has already left, because it does not yet understand that what has been removed was not supporting you. It was weighing you down. There is a difference between something that adds to your life and something that occupies it. But the mind does not always see that difference clearly. It confuses presence with value. It assumes that because something was there, it must have been important. And because it is now gone, something valuable must have been lost. But presence does not always mean purpose. There are things that stay in your life simply because you have not let them go. not because they are meant to remain, but because you have become accustomed to their presence. And when they finally leave, the absence feels unfamiliar. It creates a space that you do not know how to interpret. But that space is not emptiness, it is openness. It is the removal of something that was taking up more energy than you realized. It is the release of something that was quietly shaping your thoughts, your emotions, your sense of self. And without it, there is room for clarity, room for stillness. Room for something new that actually aligns with who you are now. But before you can experience that, you have to move through the illusion of loss. You have to sit with the feeling that something is missing without immediately trying to replace it. You have to allow the mind to adjust to the absence, to recognize that what feels like lack is actually relief in a form it does not yet understand. This requires patience, because the mind does not change its interpretations instantly. It takes time for it to see that what it labeled as loss was actually a form of release. You may notice this in the way your body responds, a subtle ease in your chest, a reduction in tension you did not even know was there, a quiet sense of space in your thoughts, where there used to be constant activity. These are not signs of something missing. They are signs of something being removed. And as you begin to pay attention to this, your perspective starts to shift. You stop asking what you lost, and you start noticing what you no longer have to carry. You see that certain worries are no longer present, that certain emotional patterns are no longer repeating, that certain pressures have quietly disappeared. And in their absence, there is a lightness that was not possible before. This is the reality that sits beneath the illusion of losing, the understanding that not everything that leaves takes something from you. Some things leave because they were taking too much. But this understanding does not come through thinking alone. It comes through experience, through allowing yourself to feel the difference between carrying something and being without it. At first, that difference may feel unfamiliar. It may feel like something is missing. But if you stay with it, if you allow yourself to exist in that space without rushing to fill it, something becomes clear. You begin to see that what you thought was supporting you was actually limiting you. That what you believed you needed was something you had simply grown used to. That what you feared losing was something that had already stopped serving you. And in seeing this, your relationship with loss changes. It is no longer something to avoid at all costs. It becomes something to understand, something to observe, something that can carry a different meaning than what you were taught. You begin to trust that when something leaves, it is not always taking something essential. Sometimes it is removing what is unnecessary. This does not mean that every loss feels easy. There are still emotions, still memories, still moments of reflection. But those experiences are no longer tied to the belief that you are now less than you were before. They are part of a process, a gradual unfolding, a rebalancing of what you carry and what you release. And over time, you begin to move differently. You hold things more lightly. You become less attached to keeping everything the same. You allow change to happen without immediately resisting it, because you understand something that was not clear before, that holding on is not always strength, and letting go is not always loss. Sometimes the greatest strength is in allowing things to leave when their time is complete. And sometimes what feels like losing is actually the beginning of a life that feels lighter, clearer, and more aligned with who you truly are. There is a quiet freedom in this understanding, not a loud, dramatic freedom, but a steady one, a freedom that does not depend on everything staying the same, but on your ability to move with what changes. And in that movement, you begin to experience life in a different way, not as something you have to control, not as something you have to hold together, but as something that flows, with things entering and leaving, with moments forming and dissolving, with experiences rising and fading. And you no longer see these movements as threats. You see them as part of the natural rhythm of life, a rhythm that does not take away from you, but continually reshapes what you carry. And when you align with that rhythm, when you stop resisting the removal of what no longer belongs, you begin to feel something that was always there, waiting beneath the weight. A sense of ease, a sense of clarity, a sense of peace that does not come from gaining more, but from finally carrying less. And as that lightness begins to settle in, something unexpected follows. Not a sudden joy, not a clear sense of relief, but a quiet, unfamiliar space that feels difficult to explain. Because after carrying weight for so long, after living within noise, tension, and constant movement, the absence of it all can feel strange, almost unsettling, almost like something is missing, even when nothing is wrong. This is where many people become confused. They expected peace to feel like comfort, like warmth, like something immediately satisfying. But instead, what they meet first is something much quieter, something emptier, something that does not yet feel like home. And this is where the next layer begins. There is a moment that arrives when the chaos fades and everything becomes still. No urgent thoughts pulling at your attention, no emotional storms demanding your energy, no constant tension running quietly in the background. Just space, just silence, just a kind of calm that feels almost unfamiliar. And in that moment, instead of relaxing into it, the mind becomes restless. It starts searching for something to hold on to. It looks for noise, for problems, for anything that feels like the intensity it has grown used to. Because even though peace is present, it does not yet feel natural. This is the strange truth. Peace at first can feel uncomfortable, not because there is something wrong with it, but because you have spent so much time living without it. Your system has adapted to chaos, to movement, to emotional highs and lows. It has learned how to function within tension. It has built patterns around it. It has created a sense of normal from it. So when that tension is no longer there, when the noise disappears, there is a gap. And the mind does not immediately recognize that gap as something positive. It sees it as absence. It sees it as something that needs to be filled. You may notice this in subtle ways. A quiet moment where everything is fine, but you still feel the urge to check something, to think about something, to bring your attention back into activity. A sense that something should be happening, even when there is nothing that needs your attention. This is not because you lack peace, it is because you are not yet used to it. The mind has been conditioned to associate intensity with meaning. It believes that if something feels strong, if it creates emotion, if it demands attention, then it must be important. And when that intensity is gone, it feels like something valuable has disappeared. But peace does not demand attention. It does not create urgency. It does not pull at your mind. It simply exists. And because it is so quiet, it can be overlooked or even mistaken for emptiness. This is why people often return to chaos without realizing it. Not because they want to suffer, but because chaos feels familiar. It gives the mind something to engage with. It creates a sense of movement, a sense that something is happening. And without that movement, there can be a feeling of restlessness, a subtle discomfort that arises in stillness, a sense that something needs to be done, even when there is nothing that requires action. But this discomfort is not a sign that something is missing. It is a sign that something has changed. It is the adjustment from a life of constant stimulation to a space of calm. And like any adjustment, it takes time. You cannot rush into peace and expect it to immediately feel comfortable. Just as the body needs time to rest after long periods of strain, the mind needs time to settle after long periods of noise. At first, the silence may feel too quiet. The space may feel too open. The absence of tension may feel unfamiliar. But if you stay with it, if you resist the urge to fill that space immediately, something begins to shift. The restlessness starts to fade. The need for constant movement begins to soften. The discomfort slowly transforms into something else, and what once felt empty begins to feel spacious. There is a difference between emptiness and space. Emptiness feels like something is missing. Space feels like something is available, and the only difference between the two is how the mind perceives it. When you first enter this quiet state, the mind interprets it as emptiness because it is used to being occupied. It is used to holding something, doing something, thinking about something. But as you remain in that state, as you allow the silence without resisting it, the perception begins to change. You start to notice the ease within it, the lack of pressure, the absence of urgency, and slowly what felt like emptiness becomes something you can rest in. This is the moment where peace begins to feel natural, not as something you chase, not as something you try to create, but as something that is already there when you stop filling every moment with noise. But this transition is delicate, because the mind will still try to return to what it knows. It may bring back old thoughts. It may create new worries. It may look for something to disturb the calm. Not because you are doing something wrong, but because it is adjusting. This is where awareness becomes important, not controlling the mind, not forcing it to be quiet, but simply noticing when it tries to recreate chaos, seeing the pattern without immediately following it, allowing the thought to pass without turning it into a story, letting the moment remain as it is without needing to change it. This practice may feel small, but it creates a shift. Because each time you choose not to return to noise, you reinforce the presence of peace. And over time, this becomes easier. The silence no longer feels uncomfortable, the space no longer feels empty, the calm no longer feels unfamiliar. It becomes something you recognize, something you trust, something you can return to without effort. There is a quiet beauty in this state, not the kind that demands attention, not the kind that stands out, but the kind that supports everything else. It allows you to move through life without carrying unnecessary tension. It allows you to experience moments without needing to control them. It allows you to exist without constantly seeking something more. And this is where peace reveals its true nature. It is not excitement. It is not intensity. It is not something that constantly changes. It is steady. It is quiet. It is always there, beneath the surface of everything else. But to feel it, you have to become comfortable with what is not loud. You have to allow yourself to be in moments where nothing is happening, to sit with stillness without trying to escape it, to experience calm without questioning it. And this is not something that happens all at once. It is a gradual shift, a movement away from constant stimulation towards something more stable, a release of the need to always be engaged, toward an ability to simply be. And in that shift, something important happens. You stop searching for peace in external things. You stop trying to create it through circumstances. You stop believing that it is something you need to achieve, because you begin to see that it is already present, waiting beneath the noise. And the more you allow that presence, the more natural it becomes. The discomfort fades, the restlessness quiets, the mind settles, and what once felt strange becomes something you rely on, a foundation that does not move, even when everything else changes. This is the deeper understanding of peace, not as something that removes all challenges, but as something that exists even when challenges arise, not as something that replaces life, but as something that supports it. And once you experience this, once you become familiar with this quiet steadiness, something shifts in the way you relate to everything else. You no longer chase intensity in the same way. You no longer feel the need to fill every space. You no longer fear silence, because you have seen what exists within it. And you understand that the emptiness you once feared was never emptiness at all. It was the beginning of something deeper, something that does not come and go, something that does not depend on circumstances, something that was always there, waiting for you to stop filling your life with noise long enough to notice it. Peace. And as that quiet peace begins to feel more natural, another challenge appears, one that is not loud but persistent. It does not disturb your outer world, but it lingers in your mind, because even when you begin to feel lighter, even when the chaos has settled, there is still a part of you that looks back, searching for something that was never given. A reason, an explanation, a final moment that makes everything make sense. This is where many people get stuck, not in what they lost, but in what they never understood. And from this place, a question keeps returning, quietly, repeatedly, refusing to disappear. There is a part of the mind that does not like unfinished stories. It wants a clear ending, something it can hold, something it can use to say, this is why it happened, this is how it ended, this is what it meant. And when that clarity is not given, the mind does not let go easily. It keeps returning to the same moment, the same conversation, the same unanswered question. It replays what was said, what was not said, what could have been said. It tries to find meaning in silence, to extract answers from something that never offered them. And this is where suffering quietly continues, not because the situation is still happening, but because the mind is still searching for closure. Closure feels like something necessary. It feels like the final step, the thing that will finally allow you to move on. The belief is simple. Once I understand it, once I get the explanation, once I hear the truth, then I will be at peace. But this belief carries a hidden trap, because it places your peace in something outside of your control. It makes your ability to let go dependent on another person, another moment, another explanation that may never come. And in doing so, it keeps you connected to what has already ended. There are endings that do not come with answers. There are situations that close without explanation. There are people who leave without saying what you needed to hear. And no matter how much you revisit it, no matter how deeply you think about it, the clarity you are searching for may never appear. This is not because you are missing something, it is because not everything is meant to be explained. The mind struggles with this. It believes that every experience should make sense, that every ending should be understood. But life does not always operate in that way. Sometimes things end without clarity, without resolution, without a final understanding that satisfies the mind. And the more you try to force that understanding, the more you stay attached to the past. You may notice how this plays out. A memory appears, and immediately the mind starts analyzing it, trying to piece it together, trying to find the missing part, trying to answer a question that was never answered. But the more you analyze, the more complex it becomes, because you are trying to create clarity where there is none. And this creates a loop, a constant return to the same moment, the same question, the same need for something that is not there. Breaking this loop does not come from finding the answer. It comes from releasing the need for one. This is where detachment from emotional closure begins. It is not about ignoring what happened. It is not about pretending it does not matter. It is about accepting that understanding is not always required for peace. There is a difference between processing something and holding on to it. Processing allows you to move through the experience. Holding on keeps you tied to it. And the need for closure often turns processing into holding, because instead of allowing the experience to settle, you keep revisiting it, hoping that something new will appear, hoping that this time it will make sense. But peace does not come from making everything make sense. It comes from allowing what does not make sense to exist without resistance. This requires a shift in perspective. Instead of asking why it happened, you begin to accept that it happened. Instead of searching for a final explanation, you allow the absence of explanation to be enough. This does not mean you stop caring. It means you stop needing something that is not available. There is a quiet strength in this, in recognizing that your peace does not depend on receiving answers, because once you stop searching for closure, something changes. The energy that was tied to the past begins to release. The constant thinking begins to slow. The need to revisit the same moment begins to fade. And in that space, there is room for something else. Not answers, not explanations, but acceptance. Acceptance is different from understanding. It does not require clarity. It does not require logic. It is simply the willingness to allow something to be what it is, without needing it to be different. This is not always easy, because the mind will still try to return. It will still bring up the same questions. It will still look for something to complete the story. But each time it does, you have a choice: to follow the thought or to let it pass, to engage with the question or to recognize that it does not need an answer. This choice may feel small, but it changes everything. Because each time you choose not to engage, you weaken the attachment. Each time you allow the question to exist without answering it, you create space, and in that space, the need for closure begins to dissolve. There is a moment where you realize something important, that the ending has already happened, that the absence of explanation is not preventing closure, that what you were waiting for is not necessary. And in that realization, there is a quiet release, not a dramatic one, not a sudden shift, but a gradual loosening. The grip on the past softens, the need to understand fades, the mind begins to rest. This is where true detachment begins. Not in forcing yourself to forget, not in trying to erase what happened, but in no longer needing to complete it. In allowing it to remain unfinished, without feeling incomplete. Because the truth is, closure is not something you receive. It is something you allow. It happens the moment you stop waiting for something that may never come, the moment you stop searching for answers that are not available, the moment you accept that peace does not require explanation. And once you reach that point, something shifts. You no longer feel tied to the past in the same way. The memory may still exist, but it no longer pulls at you. The questions may still appear, but they no longer demand your attention. There is a distance that forms, not from avoidance, but from understanding that you do not need to engage. And in that distance, there is freedom. Freedom from the need to make everything make sense. Freedom from the constant search for meaning. Freedom from the belief that you cannot move forward without first understanding everything behind you. Because you can. You can move forward without knowing why. You can find peace without receiving answers. You can let go without closure. And when you do, you begin to see something clearly. That the mind was never really searching for understanding. It was searching for control. And when you release that need for control, when you allow things to exist without fully understanding them, you step into a different kind of peace. One that does not depend on clarity, one that does not depend on resolution, one that exists even when questions remain unanswered. And in that peace, there is a quiet completion. Not because everything was explained, but because you no longer need it to be. And as you begin to release the need for answers, something even deeper starts to reveal itself. The mind becomes quieter. The constant searching begins to fade, and for the first time, there is space that is not filled with questions. But just as this quiet begins to settle, something inside resists it. Not loudly, not aggressively, but subtly, almost like a quiet discomfort that grows the longer the silence stays. Because even when the mind is no longer chasing closure, there is still something within you that does not fully trust stillness. And from that place, a new kind of movement begins. There is a part of you that does not like silence, not because silence is harmful, but because silence removes distraction. And when distraction is gone, what remains is something the ego finds difficult to face, a sense of not needing to prove anything, not needing to defend anything, not needing to become anything. And for the ego, this feels like a loss. The ego is not something separate from you. It is a pattern, a way of seeing yourself, a structure built from thoughts, memories, labels, and experiences. It is the story you tell yourself about who you are. And that story depends on activity to stay alive. It needs comparison, it needs validation, it needs movement, reaction, and engagement. Without these, it begins to lose its sense of control. This is why quiet can feel uncomfortable, because in quiet, the usual structures that define the self are not active. There is no immediate role to play, no image to maintain, no identity to defend. There is just awareness, simple, still, without the usual layers. And the ego does not know how to exist in that space. So it creates noise. Not always in obvious ways. Sometimes it is subtle. A sudden urge to check something, to think about something, to revisit a conversation, to plan something unnecessary. Small movements that pull you away from stillness and back into activity. It may bring up old concerns, it may create new worries, it may remind you of things you need to fix or improve. Not because these things are urgent, but because they keep the mind occupied. The ego thrives on occupation. It needs something to hold on to, something to engage with, something to reinforce its presence. And when there is nothing to engage with, it begins to feel like it is fading. This is where resistance appears, a quiet push against stillness, a feeling that something should be happening, even when everything is fine, a sense that being still is not enough. But this is not because stillness is lacking. It is because the ego is used to defining itself through movement. It is used to being someone who is doing something, achieving something, thinking something, reacting to something. And when that activity is no longer there, it does not know how to define itself. So it tries to recreate what it knows. It brings back old identities. It revisits past experiences. It imagines future scenarios. Anything to avoid staying in the present moment without a clear sense of self. This is why the mind often becomes louder when you try to be still. Not because stillness is difficult, but because the ego is resisting it. It sees stillness as a threat, not a physical threat, but a threat to its structure. Because in true quiet, the ego is not needed in the same way. There is no role for it to play, no problem for it to solve, no identity for it to maintain. And without these, it begins to dissolve. This dissolution is not destruction. It is not the loss of who you are. It is the loosening of the rigid identity that has been built over time. It is the softening of the need to constantly define yourself. But the ego interprets this as loss. It believes that without its structure, you will be nothing. And this belief creates fear. Not always a strong fear, but a subtle unease. A feeling that being still is not safe, that you need to keep thinking, keep doing, keep engaging. But this is only a habit, a pattern that has been reinforced over time. You have spent so long identifying with your thoughts, your roles, your reactions, that stepping outside of them feels unfamiliar. It feels like you are losing something important. But what you are actually losing is the constant need to be something. And in that loss, there is freedom. But before that freedom is recognized, there is resistance. The ego will try to pull you back into activity. It will create reasons to leave stillness. It will make silence feel uncomfortable so that you return to what is familiar. This is where awareness becomes essential. Not to fight the ego, not to silence it forcefully, but to see what it is doing. To notice when the mind starts creating noise without a real reason, to recognize when thoughts are being generated simply to avoid stillness, to observe the patterns without immediately following them. This observation creates distance. And in that distance, the ego's grip begins to loosen, because it is no longer being reinforced. Each time you see the pattern without engaging, you weaken it. Each time you remain in stillness without reacting, you strengthen your ability to stay present. And over time, something shifts. The noise becomes less convincing. The urge to fill the silence becomes weaker. The discomfort begins to fade. And what once felt like emptiness starts to feel like clarity. There is a simplicity in this state that the ego does not understand, a way of being that does not require constant definition, a presence that is not built on thoughts but on awareness itself. And in this presence, there is no need to prove anything, no need to become anything, no need to hold on to a fixed identity. There is just being. This is not something the ego can control, because it exists beyond the structures the ego creates. And this is why it resists it. But resistance does not mean it cannot be experienced. It simply means it takes patience, a willingness to stay in the quiet, even when it feels unfamiliar, a willingness to observe the mind without immediately following it, a willingness to allow the sense of self to soften without trying to hold it together. And as you do this, the relationship with the ego changes. It is no longer something that controls you. It becomes something you can see, something that arises and fades like any other pattern. And in seeing it clearly, you are no longer fully identified with it. You are not just the thoughts. You are not just the roles. You are not just the story you have been telling yourself. You are the awareness in which all of these appear. And this awareness does not need noise to exist. It does not need constant activity. It is already complete, already present, already still. The ego may continue to create movement, to bring up thoughts, to pull you into patterns, but it no longer has the same power, because you see it for what it is. And in that seeing, something becomes clear. That silence is not something to avoid. It is something to return to, not as an escape, not as a goal, but as a natural state that exists beneath all the noise. And once you become familiar with that state, once you begin to trust it, the resistance fades. The need for constant movement softens. The urge to define yourself through activity loses its hold. And what remains is something simple, something steady, something that does not depend on anything external. A quiet presence that is always there, not created, not achieved, but uncovered. And in that presence, you begin to experience life differently. Not through constant reaction, not through endless thinking, but through a clarity that does not need to be maintained. A clarity that exists when the noise is no longer necessary. And this is where true peace deepens, not in controlling the mind, but in no longer needing it to create noise. Not in becoming someone else, but in no longer needing to hold on to who you thought you were. A quiet shift from doing to being, from effort to ease, from noise to silence. And in that silence, something real begins to emerge, something that was always there, waiting beneath the layers of activity, waiting beneath the constant movement, waiting for the moment you stop trying to fill every space with something. A stillness that does not need to be protected, a presence that does not need to be defined, a peace that does not come from what you create, but from what you finally allow to be. And as that quiet presence becomes more familiar, something else begins to shift, not just within you, but around you. The same places you once moved through without question begin to feel different. The same environments that once felt natural start to feel heavy, almost like they belong to a version of you that no longer exists. And this change does not come with an announcement. It arrives slowly, subtly, until one day you realize something no longer fits the way it used to. There is a quiet moment when a place stops feeling like home, not because anything about it has changed on the outside, but because something within you has shifted. The conversations sound the same, the routines remain familiar, the environment looks exactly as it did before. But your experience of it is no longer the same, and that difference is difficult to explain, because from the outside, everything appears normal. But internally, there is a growing sense of distance, a feeling that you are no longer fully present in the same way. A subtle awareness that you are moving through something that once defined you, but no longer reflects who you are becoming. This is what it feels like to outgrow a space. It does not happen all at once. It begins quietly. A small discomfort that you cannot immediately name, a slight resistance to things that once felt easy, a sense that you are no longer aligned with the energy around you. At first, it is easy to ignore. You tell yourself that nothing is wrong, that you are just tired or distracted or overthinking, because acknowledging that you have outgrown something requires facing a deeper truth, that you have changed. And change does not always feel comfortable, especially when it begins to separate you from what once felt familiar. There is a strong attachment to environments that shaped you, places where you learned, where you struggled, where you built parts of your identity. These spaces carry memory, they carry meaning, they feel like part of who you are. So when you begin to feel disconnected from them, it can feel like you are losing something important. But what you are actually experiencing is not loss. It is evolution. You are no longer the same person who once needed that space in the same way. And because of that, the space no longer meets you where you are. This creates a quiet tension. You may still be physically present, but something inside you has already stepped away. You notice things you did not notice before. Patterns that once felt normal now feel limiting. Conversations that once felt engaging now feel repetitive, and this awareness can feel isolating, because while you are changing, everything around you may appear to be staying the same. And this is where the difficulty arises. You begin to question yourself. You wonder if you are being too critical, too distant, too disconnected. You try to adjust, to fit back into what once felt natural, but no matter how much you try, the feeling remains, because this is not something that can be fixed. It is something that needs to be acknowledged. Outgrowing a space is not about rejecting it. It is about recognizing that your relationship with it has changed. There is a tendency to think that leaving means something negative, that if you no longer fit into a space, it must mean something went wrong. But that is not always true. Sometimes a space has fulfilled its purpose. It gave you what you needed at a certain time. It supported a version of you that was necessary for your growth. But it was never meant to hold you forever. And holding on to it beyond that point creates friction, because you are trying to stay in something that no longer aligns with your direction. This friction may not always be obvious. It can show up as restlessness, a lack of energy, a feeling of being out of place without a clear reason, and because it is subtle, it is often misunderstood. You may think something needs to be fixed, that if you just try harder, adjust more, change something within yourself, you will feel comfortable again. But comfort does not come from forcing yourself to fit into something you have already outgrown. It comes from allowing yourself to move forward. This does not always mean physically leaving immediately. Sometimes the detachment happens internally first. You begin to engage differently. You stop forcing connections that no longer feel natural. You become more aware of where your energy flows easily and where it feels restricted. This internal shift creates a new relationship with the space. You are still there, but not in the same way. And over time, this awareness leads to clarity. You begin to see that staying in a space out of familiarity is not the same as belonging there. That holding on to something because it once mattered is not the same as it still being right for you. That growth requires movement, even when that movement is quiet. There is also a fear that comes with outgrowing spaces, a fear of what comes next. Because even if the current environment no longer fits, it is still known. It still provides a sense of structure, and stepping away from it means entering something uncertain. The mind prefers what it understands, even if it no longer aligns, so it tries to hold on. It reminds you of the history, the memories, the comfort that once existed. It suggests that leaving means losing something important, but what it does not show you is the cost of staying, the slow disconnection from yourself, the quiet resistance that builds over time, the energy it takes to remain in a place that no longer supports your growth. And when you begin to see this clearly, the decision becomes less about leaving and more about honoring who you are becoming. Because outgrowing something is not a mistake. It is a sign that you are moving forward, that you are not fixed, not static, not confined to one version of yourself. And as you begin to accept this, something shifts. The fear starts to soften. The need to hold on begins to loosen. The idea of change becomes less threatening. You begin to trust that moving away from what no longer fits is not something to resist. It is something to allow. There is a quiet strength in this kind of detachment, not dramatic, not forced, not filled with conflict, just a steady recognition that your path is changing. And with that recognition, your relationship with the past also changes. You no longer see those spaces as something you have to hold on to. You see them as part of your journey, something that shaped you, something that contributed to who you are, but not something that defines where you must remain. This perspective brings a different kind of peace, not the peace of staying in what is familiar, but the peace of aligning with what is true. A peace that comes from no longer forcing yourself into environments that do not match your growth. A peace that allows you to move forward without carrying unnecessary attachments. And as you continue to move in this way, something becomes clear. That belonging is not about staying in the same place forever. It is about being in alignment with where you are. And when that alignment shifts, it is not something to fear, it is something to follow. Because every space you outgrow is not something you are losing, it is something you are moving beyond. And in that movement, there is space for something new. Not something you need to rush toward, not something you need to find immediately, but something that will meet you where you are now. A space that reflects your current awareness. A space that supports your next stage of growth. And when you arrive there, it will not feel forced. It will feel natural, not because it is permanent, but because it aligns with who you are in that moment. And when the time comes, you may outgrow that space as well. Not as a failure, not as something to regret, but as part of the same quiet process, the continuous unfolding of who you are becoming. And in understanding this, you no longer fear outgrowing what once defined you. You accept it as a sign that you are not standing still, as a sign that life is moving through you, as a sign that you are no longer holding yourself back from becoming who you are meant to be. And in that acceptance, there is a quiet kind of freedom. Not loud, not dramatic, but steady. A freedom that allows you to move without resistance, to release without regret, to step forward without needing to hold on to what you have already outgrown. And in that movement, something opens. A deeper sense of alignment, a clearer sense of direction, a quieter, more grounded way of being, where you are no longer defined by where you have been, but guided by where you are becoming. And as you begin to move away from what no longer fits, something else becomes clear. Not every ending needs to be loud. Not every departure needs to be explained. Because the more you align with yourself, the less you feel the need to announce every change. What once required words now happens quietly, almost unnoticed, like a shift that only you can feel. There is a kind of strength that does not speak. It does not argue. It does not defend. It does not try to be understood. It simply steps back. And in that quiet step, something powerful begins to unfold. There is a moment when you realize you no longer have the energy to explain yourself. Not because you do not have reasons, not because you cannot put your thoughts into words, but because something deeper has shifted. The need to be understood begins to fade. The urge to justify your decisions loses its weight. And what remains is a quiet certainty that does not need validation. This is where silent withdrawal begins. It does not come from anger. It does not come from resentment. It does not come from the need to prove anything. It comes from clarity. A clarity that sees what no longer aligns. A clarity that recognizes where your energy is being drained. A clarity that understands that not everything needs to be fixed, explained, or confronted. And from that clarity, you begin to move differently. You speak less where you once explained more. You engage less where you once tried harder. You step back where you once pushed forward, not as a reaction, but as a decision. There is a common belief that every ending should be expressed, that if something changes, it should be communicated. Clearly, explained thoroughly, brought into the open so that everyone understands. But not all endings require that. Some endings are not meant to be shared. Not because they are hidden, but because they are internal. They happen within you first, in the way you no longer feel the same connection, in the way your attention naturally moves elsewhere, in the way your energy stops flowing in the same direction. And once that shift happens, the external actions follow. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but gradually. You begin to withdraw without making an announcement. You stop forcing conversations. You stop maintaining connections that feel heavy. You stop participating in situations that no longer feel right. And you do it without needing to explain every step. This kind of withdrawal is often misunderstood. Some may see it as distance. Some may see it as avoidance. Some may not understand it at all. But silent withdrawal is not about escaping. It is about aligning. It is the recognition that your energy is valuable and where you place it matters. That not every situation deserves your explanation. Not every person needs your reasoning. Not every change requires your voice. There is a difference between being silent because you are afraid and being silent because you are clear. Fear-based silence feels heavy. It carries tension, hesitation, uncertainty. It comes from not knowing what to say or how to say it. Clarity-based silence feels different. It is calm. It is steady. It is intentional. It does not come from confusion. It comes from understanding that words are not always necessary. You begin to see that explaining yourself repeatedly does not always create understanding. Sometimes it only keeps you tied to something you are already moving away from. And this is where silent withdrawal becomes powerful, because it allows you to leave without creating unnecessary noise. No arguments, no justifications, no attempts to be seen in a certain way, just a quiet shift. There is also a release in this. When you stop announcing every change, you stop seeking approval for it. You stop needing others to agree with your decisions. You stop waiting for someone else to validate your direction. And in that release, there is freedom. Freedom from the need to be understood by everyone. Freedom from the pressure to explain every choice. Freedom from the expectation that your path must make sense to others. You begin to move based on what feels right, not based on what can be explained. This does not mean you become distant or disconnected from people. It means you become more intentional. You choose where to speak and where to remain silent. You choose where to engage and where to step back. You choose where your energy is placed. And these choices are not made to control others, but to respect yourself. There is a quiet maturity in this, the understanding that not every situation needs closure, that not every relationship requires a final conversation. that sometimes the most respectful thing you can do is simply step away, not to punish, not to avoid, but to honor what has already changed. Because forcing a dramatic ending where one is not needed often creates more tension than clarity. It turns something natural into something heavy. It adds layers of emotion where there could have been simplicity. Silent withdrawal keeps things simple. It allows the ending to remain as it is, without adding unnecessary conflict. It respects the fact that some connections fade without needing to be broken. It acknowledges that not everything needs to be turned into a moment. There is also a deeper level of self-trust that develops here. When you stop announcing your decisions, you begin to rely less on external confirmation. You become more grounded in your own awareness. You learn to trust what you feel without needing to explain it. And this trust changes the way you move through life. You become less reactive, less driven by the need to prove yourself, less concerned with how others interpret your actions, because you are no longer acting for them. You are acting from within. This does not mean that communication is not important. There are moments where words are necessary, where clarity benefits both sides, where expression creates understanding. But silent withdrawal is not about avoiding communication. It is about recognizing when communication is no longer needed, when the situation has already shifted, when the connection has already changed, when the explanation would not add anything meaningful. In those moments, silence is not avoidance. It is completion, a quiet ending that does not need to be turned into something more. There is a peace in this, a peace that comes from not forcing closure where it does not naturally exist, a peace that comes from allowing things to end in their own way, a peace that comes from trusting that your actions do not always need to be explained to be valid. And as you continue to move in this way, something else becomes clear. You no longer feel the need to create dramatic moments in your life. You no longer feel the urge to turn every change into a statement. You no longer need to express every shift in a way that others can understand, because you understand it. And that is enough. There is a quiet confidence that comes with this understanding. A confidence that does not seek attention, does not demand recognition, does not need to be seen. It simply exists in the way you move, in the way you choose, in the way you step away when something no longer aligns. And in that quiet movement, there is a different kind of power, not the power of control, not the power of influence, but the power of clarity. A clarity that allows you to leave without resistance. A clarity that allows you to detach without conflict. A clarity that allows you to move forward without carrying what no longer belongs. And in that clarity, something settles. Not in the external world, but within you. A sense of ease. A sense of alignment. A sense that you no longer need to explain every step to feel certain about where you are going. And that is where silent withdrawal reveals its true strength. Not as something you do to others, but as something you do for yourself. A quiet choice, a steady movement, a release that does not need to be seen to be real, and in that release you continue forward. Without noise, without resistance, without needing to turn your growth into something that must be understood by everyone else, just moving, calmly, clearly, in the direction that feels true, and allowing what no longer belongs to fade, without needing to announce that it is gone. And as you begin to move in that quiet way, without announcements, without explanations, something else begins to surface. It is subtle at first, almost hidden beneath your calm. But it is there, a quiet awareness that not everyone will understand what you are doing, that your silence may be interpreted in ways you did not intend, that your distance may be seen as something it is not. And from that awareness, a feeling begins to rise. Not loud, not overwhelming, but present enough to be noticed. There is a fear that appears when you stop explaining yourself. Not the fear of being wrong, not the fear of making a mistake, but the fear of being misunderstood. a fear that others will create their own version of your story, that they will fill the silence with assumptions, that they will see your change through their own perspective instead of yours. And because of this, there is a pull to correct it, to speak, to clarify, to explain, to make sure they see things the way you do, to protect your image, your intention, your meaning, because being misunderstood can feel uncomfortable. It can feel like losing control over how you are seen. The mind does not like this. It wants to manage perception. It wants to shape how others think about you. It wants to maintain a certain image, a certain identity that feels safe, familiar, accepted. And when that image is no longer fully accurate, when your actions no longer match what others expect from you, there is tension. You may notice thoughts like, "They probably think I have changed too much. They may believe I am distant. They might misunderstand my silence as something negative." And these thoughts create a pressure to explain, because explaining feels like control. If you can say the right words, if you can give the right reason, if you can present your change in a way that others understand, then you can avoid being misunderstood. But this is where attachment quietly returns, not to people, not to situations, but to perception, to the idea that you need others to see you correctly in order to feel at peace. And this attachment can be just as strong as any other, because it ties your sense of stability to something outside of you, to how others interpret your actions, to how others respond to your silence, to how others define your change. But the truth is, you cannot control how others see you. No matter how clearly you explain, no matter how carefully you choose your words, people will still interpret you through their own experiences, their own expectations, their own understanding. And this is not something you can change. Because perception is not created by you alone. It is shaped by the mind of the person observing you. This is why even the same action can be seen in completely different ways by different people. One person may see your silence as peace, another may see it as distance, another may see it as indifference, and none of these interpretations are fully within your control. Trying to manage all of them is exhausting. It requires constant adjustment, constant explanation, constant awareness of how you might be perceived. It pulls you out of your own experience and into the minds of others. And in doing so, it takes you away from your own clarity. This is where detachment deepens, not just from people or situations, but from the need to control how you are seen. This does not mean you stop caring about others. It does not mean you become indifferent to how your actions affect them. It means you release the need to manage every perception. You allow people to see you in their own way, even if that way is incomplete, even if that way does not fully capture your intention, even if that way is not what you would choose. This is not easy, because there is a natural desire to be understood, to be seen clearly, to have your actions interpreted correctly, to have your intentions recognized. And when that does not happen, it can feel uncomfortable. But there is a deeper understanding that begins to form, that being understood by everyone is not necessary for peace. That clarity within yourself matters more than clarity in the minds of others. That your path does not need to make sense to everyone for it to be valid. And once you begin to see this, something shifts. The need to explain starts to soften. The urge to correct every misunderstanding begins to fade. The pressure to control perception loses its hold. You begin to move with less resistance, not because everyone understands you, but because you no longer need them to. This creates a different kind of freedom, a freedom that is not dependent on approval, a freedom that does not require constant validation, a freedom that allows you to exist as you are without adjusting yourself to fit every expectation. There is also a quiet confidence that comes with this. Not a loud confidence that seeks attention, but a steady one that does not need to prove anything. a confidence that trusts your own understanding. That does not question your path just because others do not see it. That does not require external agreement to feel certain. And in this confidence, you begin to feel lighter, because you are no longer carrying the weight of managing how you are perceived. You are no longer trying to hold together an image that no longer fits. You are no longer adjusting yourself to match expectations that you have outgrown. You are simply being. And this simplicity brings peace. Not because everything is understood, but because you are no longer trying to control what cannot be controlled. There is also a deeper compassion that develops here. Because as you release the need to control perception, you begin to see that others are doing the same thing. They are also acting from their own understanding. They are also interpreting based on their own experiences. They are also navigating their own perceptions. And this awareness softens judgment. You no longer take misunderstandings as something personal. You see them as part of how people process the world. And in seeing this, you become less reactive, less defensive, less concerned with correcting every interpretation, because you understand that clarity is not always shared, and that is okay. This does not mean you never speak, never explain, never express yourself. There are moments where communication is important, where clarity benefits connection, where words can create understanding. But those moments come from intention, not from fear, not from the need to control perception, not from the discomfort of being misunderstood, but from a genuine desire to communicate. And when communication comes from that place, it feels different. It is not forced. It is not defensive. It is not driven by anxiety. It is clear, simple, and complete. And once it is expressed, there is no need to hold on to how it is received, because you have already done what was needed. This is the balance that begins to form, between expressing when it feels right and remaining silent when it is not necessary, between allowing understanding where it can happen and accepting misunderstanding where it cannot, between caring about others and not losing yourself in their perceptions. And in this balance, something settles, a sense of ease, a sense that you are no longer pulled in different directions by the need to be seen in a certain way, a sense that your identity is no longer tied to how others interpret you. And in that sense, there is stability, not the kind that comes from control, but the kind that comes from acceptance. Acceptance that you cannot manage every perception. Acceptance that you will not be understood by everyone. Acceptance that your path may look different from what others expect. And once this acceptance is in place, something important happens. You stop hesitating in your growth. You stop holding back your changes just to maintain a certain image. You stop limiting yourself to what others can understand, because you realize that your life is not meant to be lived according to perception. It is meant to be lived according to truth. Your truth, not a fixed truth, not something that never changes, but a living understanding that evolves with you. And as that truth evolves, your actions evolve with it. Your choices, your boundaries, your direction, all begin to reflect something deeper, something that is not dependent on how it looks from the outside. And this is where detachment becomes complete in a new way. Not just letting go of what no longer fits, not just releasing the need for closure, not just stepping away from old patterns, but also releasing the need to be fully understood in the process. Because being misunderstood is not a failure. It is simply a part of being human. And once you accept that, once you stop trying to avoid it, you begin to move more freely. Without hesitation, without constant explanation, without the pressure to shape every perception. And in that freedom, there is something quiet, something steady, something that does not need to be seen to be real. A sense of alignment that exists within you, unchanged by how others interpret it, unshaken by how it appears from the outside, simply present, simply true. And in that truth, you continue forward. Not to be understood by everyone, but to be at peace within yourself. And as you begin to release the need to be understood, something even deeper begins to unfold within you. It is no longer about how others see you. It is not even about how clearly you can explain your own change. It becomes something quieter, something more internal. A shift that happens before you can fully describe it, before you can even make sense of it. Because sometimes the letting go does not begin in the mind. It begins somewhere deeper. There are moments in life when something ends within you before you can explain why. The connection that once felt strong begins to loosen. The attachment that once held you tightly begins to fade. The emotions that once pulled you towards something begin to quiet down, and when this happens, it can feel confusing because your mind has not caught up yet. Your thoughts are still searching for reasons, still trying to understand what changed, still looking for something to point to and say, "This is why." But the feeling is already gone. And this creates a strange space. A space where your heart has already released something, but your mind is still holding on. You may find yourself questioning it. Why does this no longer feel the same? Why do I feel distant without a clear reason? Why is something that once mattered now quiet inside me? And because the mind does not have clear answers, it tries to recreate the old feeling. It goes back through memories. It revisits past emotions. It searches for what used to be there. But no matter how much it tries, the connection is no longer the same. Because the shift did not begin in the mind. It began in your awareness. There is a deeper intelligence within you that does not always operate through logic. It does not explain itself in words. It does not always follow a sequence that can be clearly understood. It simply responds to what aligns, to what no longer fits, to what is ready to be released. And when it responds, it does not wait for your mind to agree. It moves first. This is why emotional detachment can feel sudden. Not because it happens instantly, but because the moment you become aware of it, it is already there. The process may have been happening quietly in the background for a long time. Small shifts in how you feel, subtle changes in how you respond. A gradual movement away from something that once felt central. But because these changes were not loud, they were not immediately noticed. Until one day you feel it clearly, and by that time, the heart has already let go. This can be difficult to accept because the mind wants understanding before it accepts change. It wants reasons. It wants clarity. It wants something that makes sense, but not everything unfolds in that order. Sometimes the feeling changes first, and the understanding comes later. This requires a different kind of trust. A trust that does not depend on immediate explanation. A trust that allows you to acknowledge what you feel, even when you cannot fully explain it. This is not about ignoring logic. It is about recognizing that logic is not always the starting point. There are layers of awareness that exist beyond thought, and when those layers shift, the mind takes time to catch up. During this time, there can be resistance. You may try to hold on to what you once felt. You may question whether the change is real. You may attempt to reconnect with something that no longer resonates. Because letting go without understanding feels uncertain. It feels like stepping into something without a clear direction. But the longer you sit with the feeling, the clearer it becomes. Not through analysis, but through presence. You begin to notice that the emotional pull is no longer there, that the attachment does not return in the same way, that even when you try to bring it back, it feels forced. And in this recognition, something softens. You begin to accept that the shift is real, even if you cannot fully explain it. This acceptance creates space, a space where the mind no longer has to rush to understand, a space where you can simply observe what is happening within you, and as you observe, clarity begins to form, not all at once, not in a single moment, but gradually. You begin to see patterns, you begin to understand what changed. You begin to recognize why the connection faded, but this clarity does not come from forcing answers. It comes from allowing the process to unfold. There is also a release that happens when you stop demanding immediate understanding. You stop pressuring yourself to explain everything. You stop feeling like you need to justify your emotions. You stop trying to make sense of every shift as soon as it happens. And in that release, there is calm. A calm that comes from allowing things to be as they are, without rushing to define them, without needing to fully understand them right away. This calm allows the mind to settle. And when the mind settles, it becomes more open, more receptive, more able to see clearly. And this is when understanding begins to emerge naturally, not as something forced, but as something revealed. You begin to see that the detachment was not random, that it did not happen without reason, that there were signs, shifts, changes that led to this moment. But you also see that these reasons were not always visible at first. They were felt before they were understood. And this changes the way you relate to your own experience. You begin to trust your feelings more. Not blindly, not without awareness, but with a deeper respect. A respect for the part of you that recognizes what aligns and what does not, even before it can be explained. This does not mean every feeling should be followed without reflection. It means that feelings can be acknowledged without immediate judgment, that they can be observed without being dismissed, that they can be explored without needing instant answers. This creates a balance between feeling and understanding, between awareness and logic, between what is sensed and what is explained. And in this balance, there is clarity, a clarity that does not rush, a clarity that unfolds in its own time, a clarity that respects the process instead of forcing it. There is also a deeper peace that comes from this, because you are no longer in conflict with yourself. You are no longer trying to force your mind to match your feelings immediately. You are no longer resisting the fact that something has changed. You are allowing both parts of yourself to move at their own pace. The heart releases when it is ready. The mind understands when it can, and neither needs to be rushed. This understanding brings a different kind of stability, not a rigid stability that depends on everything making sense right away, but a flexible one that allows for uncertainty. That allows for not knowing, that allows for change to happen before it is fully explained. And in that flexibility, there is strength, because you are no longer dependent on immediate clarity to move forward. You can continue even when you do not have all the answers. You can trust the direction of your experience, even when the details are not yet clear. You can allow yourself to let go, even when the reasons are still forming. And this ability changes the way you experience detachment. It is no longer something confusing or unsettling. It becomes something natural, something that unfolds as part of your growth, something that does not need to be fully understood to be real. And as you continue to move in this way, something becomes clear. That not every shift needs to be explained before it is accepted, that not every change needs to be justified before it is honored. That sometimes the most honest thing you can do is to acknowledge what you feel, even when your mind is still catching up. And in doing so, you create space. Space for understanding to come naturally. Space for clarity to develop without pressure. Space for your experience to unfold without resistance. And in that space, both your heart and your mind begin to align. Not by force, not by urgency, but by time. The heart has already moved, the mind begins to follow, and eventually they meet, in a place of understanding that feels complete. Not because it was rushed, but because it was allowed. And in that meeting, there is peace, a quiet, steady peace that comes from no longer being divided within yourself, from no longer needing everything to make sense immediately, from trusting that what you feel has its own intelligence, and that understanding will come when it is ready. And with that trust, you continue forward. Not with all the answers, but with a deeper sense of alignment. A sense that even when you do not fully understand, you are still moving in the right direction, and that is enough. And as your heart and mind begin to move in quiet agreement, something else slowly comes into view. It is not about people, not about places, not even about emotions anymore. It is about time. The invisible structure you built around your life, the sequence you believed things should follow, the quiet expectations you carried without always realizing it. Because even when you let go of attachments, there can still be one thing holding on. The timeline you created. There is a quiet pressure that comes from believing life should happen in a certain order. Not always spoken out loud, not always clearly defined, but deeply felt. A sense that by a certain age, certain things should be in place. That by a certain point, you should have figured things out. That your life should follow a path that feels steady, predictable, and complete. And when it does not, something inside you begins to tighten. A subtle discomfort, a quiet comparison, a feeling that you are somehow behind. This pressure does not always come from others. It often comes from within. From the expectations you built over time. From the ideas you absorbed about what progress looks like. From the way you imagined your life unfolding. You may have seen it clearly at one point. A plan, a direction, a sequence of events that made sense to you. This is when things will happen. This is how it will unfold. This is where I will be. And for a while, this structure can feel comforting. It gives you a sense of control. It creates the illusion that if you follow the right steps, everything will fall into place exactly as expected. But life does not always move in straight lines. It shifts. It changes direction. It unfolds in ways that are not always predictable. And when this happens, the timeline you created begins to feel heavy. Not because it was wrong, but because it was limited. It was based on what you knew at the time, on what you believed was possible, on what made sense from where you were. But as you grow, as your awareness expands, as your path begins to change, that timeline no longer fits. And holding on to it creates tension. You may find yourself thinking, this should have happened by now. I thought I would be further along. I did not expect things to look like this. And these thoughts create a quiet form of resistance. Because instead of meeting life where it is, you are comparing it to where you thought it would be. This comparison pulls you out of the present. It places your attention on what is missing instead of what is here. It turns your experience into something that feels incomplete, even when it is unfolding exactly as it needs to. This is where detachment becomes necessary again. Not from people, not from emotions, but from expectation, from the idea that your life must follow a specific timeline in order to be valid. This is not easy, because timelines create a sense of identity. They tell you who you are based on where you are. They measure your progress against a set of expectations that feel real, even though they are often imagined. And letting go of that measurement can feel unsettling, because without it, there is no clear marker of where you should be, no fixed point to compare yourself against, no defined sense of whether you are on track. But this is also where freedom begins. Because when you release the timeline, you release the pressure that comes with it. You are no longer chasing a version of your life that exists only in your mind. You are no longer measuring your worth based on how closely you match an expectation. You are no longer feeling behind simply because reality does not look the way you planned. Instead, you begin to see life differently, not as something that must follow a sequence, but as something that unfolds in its own time, in its own way. You begin to notice that some of the most important shifts in your life did not happen when you expected them to. They happened unexpectedly. They came at moments you could not have planned. They unfolded in ways that did not match your original vision. And yet, they brought you exactly what you needed. This changes your perspective. You begin to see that the timeline was never fully accurate. It was a projection, a guess, a structure created to make the unknown feel more certain. But life is not bound by that structure. It moves according to something deeper, something that cannot always be predicted or controlled. And when you begin to trust this, something softens. The urgency begins to fade. The need to rush disappears. The pressure to keep up dissolves. You start to feel less concerned with when things will happen, and more present with what is happening now. This presence creates a different kind of awareness. You begin to see opportunities that you might have missed before. You begin to recognize growth that is not measured by external milestones. You begin to understand that your path is not behind or ahead. It is simply yours. There is also a release that comes with letting go of comparison, because timelines are often shaped by what you see around you, what others are doing, where others seem to be. And this creates an invisible standard, a sense that you should be at a similar point, that your life should look a certain way by now. But when you detach from the timeline, you also detach from this comparison. You stop measuring your progress against someone else's path. You stop assuming that there is a universal sequence that everyone must follow. You begin to see that each life unfolds differently. Not because one is better or worse, but because each is shaped by different experiences, different lessons, different timing. And in recognizing this, you allow yourself to move at your own pace, without judgment, without pressure, without the constant feeling that you need to catch up. This does not mean you stop growing. It does not mean you lose direction. It means your growth becomes more natural, more aligned, more connected to your actual experience instead of an imagined schedule. You still move forward, you still evolve, but you do it without the weight of expectation. And this makes the process feel lighter, more open, more real. There is also a deeper trust that develops here, a trust that your life is not delayed, that things are not late, that what is meant to unfold will do so at the right time. Not according to your timeline, but according to a timing that you may not fully understand. This trust is not passive. It does not mean you stop taking action. It means your actions are no longer driven by urgency or fear. They are guided by clarity, by presence, by an understanding that forcing things to happen at a specific time does not always lead to the right outcome. And as you begin to live in this way, something changes. You feel less rushed, less anxious, less concerned with where you should be. You feel more grounded in where you are. And from that place, your decisions become clearer, because they are not based on pressure, they are based on alignment. You choose what feels right, not what fits a timeline. You move when it feels natural, not when you think you are supposed to. You allow your life to unfold instead of trying to force it into a predetermined shape. And in this allowing, there is peace. A quiet, steady peace that comes from no longer being in conflict with time, from no longer feeling like you are falling behind, from no longer measuring your life against something that was never fixed to begin with. This peace does not come from everything being certain. It comes from accepting uncertainty, from understanding that not everything can be planned, that not everything will happen when you expect it to, and that this does not mean something is wrong. It simply means life is moving in its own way. And when you begin to accept this fully, something shifts within you. You stop resisting where you are. You stop wishing things were different. You stop holding on to a version of your life that no longer fits. And instead you begin to engage with what is present, with what is real, with what is unfolding right now. And in that engagement there is a different kind of progress. Not the kind that is measured by time, but the kind that is felt through growth, through awareness, through the quiet changes that shape who you are becoming. And when you look back, you begin to see something clearly. That even though your life did not follow the timeline you created, it still brought you exactly where you needed to be. Not in the way you expected, but in a way that makes sense when you allow yourself to see it. And in that understanding, there is a release from the need to control when things happen, a release from the belief that there is a right or wrong time, a release from the pressure to match an expectation that was never fixed. And in that release there is space to move freely, space to grow naturally, space to experience life without constantly measuring it. And in that space, something becomes clear, that your life is not late, it is not behind. It is not out of order, it is simply unfolding. And when you trust that unfolding, you begin to move with it instead of against it. And in that movement, there is a quiet kind of peace, not forced, not created, but revealed. As something that was always there once you stopped trying to control the timing of everything around you. And as the grip of time begins to loosen, something even more subtle begins to reveal itself. It is not about when things happen, but about why you hold on to certain roles, not because you have to, but because they quietly define how you see yourself. And when the pressure of timelines fades, what remains is a deeper question. Who are you when no one needs you? There is a quiet satisfaction in being needed. It does not always announce itself. It does not always feel like something you are holding on to. It can feel natural, even good. Being the one people rely on, the one who shows up, the one who fixes, supports, carries, listens. It creates a sense of purpose, a sense that you matter, because your presence fills a space. Your actions solve a problem. Your energy becomes something others depend on. And over time, this role begins to shape your identity. Not in a loud way, but in a steady, consistent way. You begin to see yourself through what you provide, through how much you give, through how much you are needed. And without realizing it, something forms, a quiet attachment, not just to people, but to the feeling of being necessary. At first, it feels like connection. It feels like care. It feels like being involved in something meaningful. But underneath that, there is something more subtle, a reliance, because when you are needed, you feel certain of your place. You know where you stand. You know how you contribute. You know how you are seen. And that certainty can become something you hold on to. You may not notice it while everything is stable, while people continue to rely on you, while your role remains unchanged. But the moment that need begins to shift, something inside you reacts. When someone no longer depends on you in the same way, when your presence is no longer required as it once was, when the role you carried begins to fade, there is a feeling that arises, a subtle discomfort, a quiet emptiness, and sometimes a question. If I am no longer needed in this way, then who am I here? This is where the attachment becomes visible, because the discomfort is not about losing people, it is about losing the identity that came from being needed. This can lead to patterns that are difficult to see. You may find yourself holding on to roles longer than they naturally last, continuing to give even when it feels draining, stepping in where you are no longer required. Not because it is necessary, but because it maintains a sense of self. There is also a tendency to anticipate needs, to stay one step ahead, to remain indispensable, to make sure your presence is always required. Because if you are always needed, you never have to face the question of who you are without that role. But this creates a quiet form of dependency, not from others, but within yourself. Your sense of value becomes tied to how much others rely on you. And this can be exhausting, because it places your identity outside of you, in the needs of others, in the expectations of others, in the roles you fulfill. And when those things change, your sense of self feels unstable. This is why detachment here is important, not from caring, not from supporting, not from being present in the lives of others, but from needing to be needed. There is a difference. Caring comes from a place of openness. It flows naturally, without expectation, without attachment to outcome. Being needed often comes with a hidden condition, that your value is confirmed through your usefulness. And when you begin to see this clearly, something shifts. You start to question your motivations, not with judgment, but with awareness. Am I doing this because it feels right, or because it keeps me in a certain role? Am I giving from a place of fullness, or from a place of needing to feel necessary? Am I present because I choose to be, or because I fear what happens if I am not? These questions do not create immediate answers, but they open a space where you begin to separate your identity from your role. And in that space, something new begins to form, a sense of self that is not dependent on how much you are needed, a presence that exists even when you are not required, a quiet stability that does not rely on external validation. This can feel unfamiliar at first, because when you stop attaching yourself to being needed, there is a gap. A space where the old identity no longer holds, but the new one has not fully settled. And in that space, there can be discomfort, a feeling of not knowing where you fit, a sense of stepping back without a clear role to replace it. But this space is not empty. It is open. Open for something more authentic to emerge. You begin to discover parts of yourself that were not defined by what you provide, parts of yourself that exist independently of how others depend on you, your interests, your thoughts, your presence without function. And this discovery is important because it shifts your relationship with others. You are no longer showing up to maintain a role. You are showing up as you are, without needing to prove your value through constant action, without needing to secure your place through usefulness. This creates a different kind of connection, one that is not based on dependency, one that is not held together by roles, one that allows space for both you and the other person to exist freely. There is also a release in this, because you are no longer carrying the weight of always being the one who must show up. You are no longer responsible for filling every gap. You are no longer tied to the expectation of always being needed. And in that release, there is energy that was previously used to maintain a certain identity, energy that can now be directed inward, toward your own growth, toward your own awareness, toward your own sense of being. This does not make you less caring. It makes your care more genuine, because it is no longer driven by the need to be necessary. It is driven by choice. You give when it feels right. You step in when it aligns. You support without losing yourself in the process. And this balance is important, because it allows you to remain connected without becoming dependent on that connection. It allows you to be present without needing to be central. It allows you to care without attaching your identity to that care. There is also a deeper understanding that forms, that people do not need you in order for you to have value, that your presence is not defined by your usefulness, that who you are exists beyond what you do for others. And this understanding changes everything, because it removes the pressure to constantly prove your worth. It allows you to exist without needing to justify your place. It creates a sense of peace that is not tied to external roles. And in that peace, something settles. A quiet confidence, a steady awareness, a sense that you are enough, even when you are not needed. And from that place, your actions become more aligned. You are no longer driven by the need to hold on. You are guided by clarity. You know when to step in. You know when to step back. You know when your presence is needed and when it is not. And you are okay with both. This is where true detachment begins to take shape, not as distance, not as withdrawal, but as freedom. Freedom from the need to be defined by what you provide. Freedom from the attachment to roles that no longer serve you. Freedom to exist as you are, without needing to be necessary to feel complete. And in that freedom, there is something quiet, something steady, something that does not depend on others to be real. A sense of self that remains regardless of who needs you or when they need you. And in that sense, there is peace. Not because you are no longer involved in the lives of others, but because your involvement no longer defines you. You are no longer holding on to being needed. You are simply present. And that presence is enough. And as you begin to stand in that quiet place where your value is no longer tied to being needed, something else begins to reveal itself. Even when the roles fall away, even when the attachments loosen, there can still be something holding the past in place. Not outside of you, not in people or situations, but within your own mind. A voice that keeps returning to what has already happened, a quiet replay that never fully ends. There is a part of the mind that does not like unfinished stories. It goes back again and again to moments that are already gone, conversations that ended, decisions that were made, situations that cannot be changed. And it does not just remember them, it reshapes them, replays them, reimagines them. It asks questions that no longer have answers. What if I had said something different? What if I had seen it earlier? What if I had chosen another path? And each time it does this, it creates the illusion that the past is still active, as if something is still open, as if something still needs to be resolved. This is how attachment continues, even after everything else has ended. Not through the situation itself, but through the story the mind keeps telling about it. This inner narrator can feel familiar. It feels like reflection. It feels like thinking things through. It feels like trying to understand. But there is a difference between understanding and looping. Understanding moves forward. Looping stays in the same place. It circles the same moments without reaching a clear end. It revisits the same scenes without creating new insight. It keeps the emotional charge alive, even when the event itself is long gone. And this is where the weight remains, not in what happened, but in how often it is replayed. The more the mind returns to something, the more real it feels in the present, even if it no longer exists. You may notice how certain memories carry the same emotion each time they arise, the same tension, the same regret, the same pull. As if time has not passed at all. This is not because the event is still happening, it is because the mind is still holding it. And it does this for a reason. The mind believes that by replaying something, it can find closure, that by going over it enough times, it will finally understand, that by analyzing every detail, it will reach a point where everything makes sense. But this rarely happens, because the past does not change with repetition. It remains as it was. And the more you try to solve it from the present, the more you stay connected to it. This is where detachment becomes internal, not from people, not from situations, but from the narrative itself, from the voice that keeps bringing you back. Letting go of this narrator does not mean you forget. It does not mean you lose your memories. It means you change your relationship with them. Instead of being pulled into them, you begin to observe them. You notice when the mind starts to replay something. You become aware of the pattern, not to stop it immediately, not to force it away, but to see it clearly. And in seeing it, something shifts. The automatic pull begins to weaken. because you are no longer fully inside the story. You are aware of it. This awareness creates space. A space between you and the thought. A space where you can choose whether to continue the loop or let it pass. At first, this space may feel small. The thoughts may still feel strong. The urge to follow them may still be present. But the more you notice, the more that space grows. And in that space, there is a different kind of control. Not control over the past, but control over your attention. You begin to see that the power of the loop is not in the memory itself. It is in how much attention it receives. Each time you follow the thought, it strengthens. Each time you step back, it softens. This is not about suppressing thoughts. It is about not feeding them. There is also a deeper understanding that begins to form. That not everything needs to be resolved in the way the mind wants. Some things do not have clear answers. Some moments cannot be fully explained. Some experiences are meant to be felt and then released, not endlessly analyzed. And accepting this changes the way you engage with your own mind. You stop demanding that every thought leads somewhere. You stop expecting every memory to provide closure. You allow some things to remain as they are, incomplete but not unresolved, because resolution does not always come from understanding every detail. Sometimes it comes from no longer needing to. There is a quiet relief in this, a release from the pressure to figure everything out, a release from the need to keep returning to the same place, a release from the belief that clarity must come from repetition, and in that release, the mind begins to settle, the loops become less frequent, the intensity begins to fade, the past starts to feel like something that has already happened, not something that is still active. This does not mean the memories disappear, they remain, but they lose their hold. They no longer pull you in with the same force. They no longer carry the same weight. They become part of your experience, not something that defines your present. There is also a shift in how you relate to time. The mind often brings the past into the present through these loops. It blurs the line between what is happening now and what has already happened. But when you step out of the narrative, that line becomes clearer. You begin to see that the present is separate. That what you are experiencing now is not the same as what happened before. And this clarity creates a different kind of presence. You are no longer split between past and present. You are here, fully, without being pulled back. This presence is not something you force. It is something that emerges when the loops quiet down, when the mind no longer needs to keep returning to the same place, when your attention is no longer tied to what has already ended. And in that presence, there is peace, not because everything has been explained, not because every question has been answered, but because you are no longer caught in the repetition. You are no longer living inside the story. You are simply aware of it. And that awareness changes everything, because it gives you a choice to stay in the loop or to step out, to continue replaying or to let the moment pass. And each time you choose to step out, even in a small way, something shifts. The attachment weakens, the weight lightens. The mind becomes quieter, not all at once, not completely, but gradually. And in that gradual change, you begin to feel something different, a sense of space within your own thoughts, a sense that not everything needs to be followed, a sense that you are not defined by the stories your mind tells. And from that space, a new way of being begins to form, one that is not tied to the past, one that is not controlled by mental repetition, one that allows you to move forward without carrying what has already been lived. This does not mean you stop learning from your experiences. It means you stop reliving them. It means you take what is needed and leave the rest. It means you allow the past to remain where it belongs, behind you. And as you continue to practice this, something becomes clear. That the mind will always create stories. That thoughts will always arise. But you do not have to follow all of them. You do not have to stay in every narrative. You do not have to keep replaying what has already ended. You can let it pass, not by force, not by resistance, but by awareness. And in that awareness, there is freedom. A quiet freedom, a steady freedom. A freedom that does not come from controlling the mind, but from no longer being controlled by it. And in that freedom, you begin to experience life differently. Not through the lens of the past, not through the repetition of old stories, but through the clarity of the present. And in that clarity, something settles, a stillness, a lightness, a sense that you are no longer carrying what you do not need. And that in itself is a form of peace. A peace that comes not from changing what has happened, but from changing your relationship with it. A peace that allows you to move forward, not because the past is gone, but because it no longer holds you in place. And as the noise of constant replay begins to fade, something unfamiliar starts to take its place. Not answers, not final explanations, but a quiet space where questions remain without urgency. A space that once felt uncomfortable, but now begins to feel different. Because when the mind stops chasing the past, it begins to face something it has always tried to avoid, not knowing. There is a deep discomfort in unanswered questions, a feeling that something is incomplete, that something is missing, that until you understand fully, you cannot rest. The mind searches for resolution, for clarity, for something solid it can hold on to. Why did it happen this way? Why did they act like that? Why did things change without warning? These questions can stay with you long after the moment has passed, not because they still matter in the same way, but because they were never answered in a way that satisfied the mind. And so the mind keeps reaching. It believes that if it finds the answer, everything will settle. That clarity will bring peace. That once it understands, it can finally let go. But what if peace does not come from answers? What if it comes from something else? There is a point where you begin to see that not every question will be resolved. Not every situation will make complete sense. Not every action will have a clear explanation. Not every ending will come with closure. And at first, this realization can feel unsettling, because it removes the possibility of certainty. It leaves you in a space where things are open, undefined, unfinished. And the mind does not like this. It wants conclusions. It wants finality. It wants something that feels complete, but life does not always provide that. And when you begin to accept this, something begins to change. Instead of fighting the uncertainty, you start to sit with it, not as something to solve, but as something to experience. This is where a different kind of peace begins to form. A peace that is not based on knowing, but on allowing. Allowing questions to exist without needing immediate answers. Allowing uncertainty to be present without turning it into a problem. Allowing the unknown to remain open without trying to close it. This does not happen all at once. At first, there is still a pull toward resolution. A habit of wanting to understand, a tendency to return to the same questions. But as you continue to observe this pattern, something softens. You begin to notice that the urgency is not coming from the question itself. It is coming from your resistance to not knowing. And when that resistance begins to ease, the pressure fades. The question may still be there, but it no longer carries the same weight. It no longer feels like something that must be answered immediately. It becomes something that simply exists, without urgency, without tension, without the need to define it right away. This shift creates space, a space where your mind is no longer constantly searching, a space where your attention is no longer pulled in every direction, a space where you can rest, even without full clarity. And in that space, there is calm. Not the calm of having everything figured out, but the calm of not needing to. There is also a deeper trust that begins to develop here. A trust that understanding will come when it is ready, not when you force it, not when you demand it, but when the time is right. And sometimes that understanding may not come in the form you expect. It may not be a clear answer. It may not be a single realization. It may be a gradual shift in perspective, a quiet clarity that forms over time. Or it may be something even simpler, the realization that you no longer need the answer, that what once felt important has lost its hold, that the question itself no longer carries the same meaning. And when this happens, something becomes clear. That peace was never dependent on the answer. It was dependent on your relationship with the question. This changes everything, because it shows you that you can be at peace even when things are unresolved, that you can feel calm even when life is uncertain, that you do not need to close every loop in order to move forward. There is also a sense of freedom in this, because the need for constant resolution can be exhausting. It keeps your mind active, searching, analyzing, trying to make sense of everything. But when you release that need, your energy shifts. You are no longer caught in endless thinking. You are no longer trying to solve what may not need to be solved. You are simply present with what is. This presence is powerful, because it allows you to experience life without constantly trying to define it, to move through moments without needing to label them, to feel without needing to fully understand. And in that experience, there is depth, a deeper connection to the present, a deeper awareness of what is actually happening now, instead of being pulled into what is missing. There is also a quiet acceptance that begins to form, not as resignation, not as giving up, but as understanding. Understanding that life is not meant to be fully controlled, that uncertainty is not something to eliminate, that questions are not always problems. Sometimes they are simply part of the experience. And when you begin to see them this way, they lose their intensity. They become lighter, more open, less demanding. And in that lightness, you begin to feel something different, a sense of ease, a sense that you are no longer chasing something, a sense that you can exist without needing to complete every thought. This ease changes the way you move through life. You become less reactive, less driven by the need to fix everything, less focused on finding answers for every situation, because you understand that not everything needs to be resolved in order to be okay. There is also a deeper form of wisdom that develops here, not the kind that comes from having all the answers, but the kind that comes from being comfortable without them. A wisdom that allows you to sit with complexity, to hold space for uncertainty, to move forward even when things are not fully clear. And this wisdom creates stability. Not the rigid kind that depends on certainty, but a flexible kind that allows for change, for unknown outcomes, for questions that remain open. And in that flexibility there is strength, because you are no longer shaken by what you do not know. You are no longer unsettled by what you cannot explain. You are grounded even in uncertainty. There is also a quiet shift in how you relate to life itself. You begin to see that not everything is meant to be understood immediately, that some things unfold slowly, that some answers reveal themselves over time, and that forcing clarity too soon can sometimes take you away from what is actually happening. This patience allows life to unfold naturally, without pressure, without force, without the constant need to reach a conclusion. And in that unfolding, there is beauty, not in the answers, but in the experience itself, in the way things evolve, in the way understanding emerges, in the way life reveals itself moment by moment. And as you begin to live in this way, something settles within you, a quiet acceptance, a steady calm, a sense that you are no longer in conflict with the unknown, that you are no longer trying to turn uncertainty into something fixed, that you can exist within it without needing to escape it, and in that acceptance there is peace. Not because everything is clear, but because you are no longer resisting what is not. You are allowing questions to remain, allowing life to unfold, allowing yourself to be present even without full understanding. And in that allowing, something opens, a deeper sense of freedom, a wider awareness, a quieter mind, where you are no longer chasing answers, you are simply living. And in that way of living, something becomes clear. That peace was never at the end of the question. It was always in how you held it. And when you hold it lightly, without urgency, without resistance, without the need to force a conclusion, it no longer weighs you down. It becomes part of the flow, part of the experience, part of the quiet unfolding of your life. And in that unfolding, you find something steady, something calm, something that does not depend on answers to exist. A peace that remains, even when questions do not. And as you begin to rest in that quiet space, where questions no longer demand answers, something even more personal begins to rise to the surface. It is not about the past, not about uncertainty, but about something that has shaped your sense of worth for a long time. Something subtle, often hidden beneath your actions and choices. The quiet desire to be chosen. There is a moment, often unnoticed, where you realize how much of your life has been shaped by waiting. Waiting to be recognized, waiting to be selected, waiting to be valued by someone else's decision. It can appear in different forms, wanting to be the one they pick, wanting to be the one they stay for, wanting to be the one they notice above everyone else. And when that choice does not come, or when it is given and later taken away, something inside you feels unsettled. Not always loudly, not always dramatically, but enough to be felt, because somewhere along the way, worth became connected to being chosen. Not completely, not in every way, but just enough to influence how you see yourself. If I am chosen, it means I am enough. If I am not, it must mean something is missing. This belief does not always come from one moment. It builds slowly. Through experiences where attention felt important, through situations where approval felt like confirmation, through moments where being selected created a sense of identity, and over time it becomes something you carry, a quiet expectation. That being chosen is what gives something meaning. That being chosen is what confirms your place. That being chosen is what makes you feel secure. But this creates a fragile foundation, because if your sense of worth depends on someone else's decision, then it is always uncertain, always shifting, always at risk of changing. And this uncertainty can shape your behavior in ways that are not always obvious. You may find yourself adjusting, trying to become what you think will be chosen, holding back parts of yourself that feel too much or not enough, presenting a version that feels more acceptable, more likely to be selected. Not because you are not enough, but because you have learned to associate acceptance with worth. There is also a quiet fear that comes with this. The fear of not being chosen, the fear of being overlooked, the fear of being passed by while others are selected. And this fear can create a constant awareness, a subtle comparison, a feeling that you must keep up, stand out, prove something in order to be seen. But this effort is exhausting, because it is not grounded in who you are. It is grounded in how you are perceived, and perception is something you cannot fully control. This is where detachment begins to take on a deeper meaning, not just letting go of people or situations, but letting go of the belief that your value is decided by someone else, that your worth is something that must be confirmed externally. This does not happen all at once. It begins with awareness, a recognition of how often the desire to be chosen influences your thoughts, how often it shapes your reactions, how often it creates a sense of lack when it is not fulfilled, and in that recognition, something begins to shift. You start to question the belief itself. Why does being chosen feel so important? What does it mean when I am not? Who am I without that validation? These questions do not always have immediate answers, but they open a space where you begin to separate your worth from the outcome, where you begin to see that being chosen is not a measure of your value. It is simply a decision, a moment, an interaction shaped by many factors, most of which are not about you. And when you begin to see this clearly, the weight starts to lift. You no longer see rejection as a reflection of who you are. You no longer see being overlooked as a sign of lack. You begin to understand that selection is not the same as worth, that someone choosing you does not add to who you are, and someone not choosing you does not take anything away. This understanding creates a different kind of stability, because it is no longer dependent on external decisions. It is rooted within you. There is also a shift in how you relate to others. You no longer approach situations from a place of seeking validation. You approach them from a place of presence. You are not trying to be chosen. You are simply showing up as you are. And this changes everything. Because when you are no longer trying to be selected, you become more authentic, more relaxed, more aligned with yourself. There is no pressure to perform, no need to adjust, no constant awareness of how you are being perceived. Just a quiet confidence, a sense that you are enough, regardless of the outcome. This does not mean you stop caring about connection. It does not mean you withdraw from relationships. It means your connection is no longer based on approval. It is based on alignment. You are drawn to what feels right, not what confirms your worth. You engage with what resonates, not what validates you. And in that shift, your relationships become more real, less dependent, less driven by the need to be chosen. There is also a release from comparison, because the desire to be chosen often creates a subtle competition, a feeling that you must stand out, be better, be more in order to be selected. But when you detach from that desire, the comparison fades. You are no longer measuring yourself against others. You are no longer seeing their path as a reflection of your own. You begin to understand that everyone's experience is different, that someone else being chosen does not mean you are less, that value is not limited, that there is no fixed amount of worth to be distributed. And in that understanding, there is peace, a quiet acceptance of yourself as you are, without needing to be confirmed, without needing to be selected, without needing to be seen in a certain way. This peace is not loud. It is not something you announce. It is something you feel, a steady sense of being grounded in yourself, a calm that does not depend on external approval, a clarity that allows you to move without hesitation. And from this place, your choices change. You no longer chase what might choose you. You choose what aligns with you. You no longer wait to be accepted. You accept yourself. You no longer define your worth through someone else's decision. You define it through your own awareness. This is where true detachment happens, not as rejection of others, not as distance from connection, but as freedom from the need to be validated. A freedom that allows you to engage fully without losing yourself, to connect deeply without attaching your identity to the outcome, to be present without needing to be chosen to feel complete. And in that freedom, something settles, a sense of enoughness, not as an idea, not as something you tell yourself, but as something you feel, a quiet knowing that you are already whole, that your value does not begin when someone chooses you, and it does not end when they do not. It simply is. And in that realization, there is a deep kind of peace, a peace that cannot be taken away by rejection, a peace that is not increased by approval, a peace that remains steady regardless of external decisions. And as you continue to move in this way, something becomes clear. That being chosen is not the goal. Being aligned is. Being true to yourself. Being present in your own life. Being grounded in your own worth. And when you live from that place, you no longer feel like you are waiting. You are already there, already complete, already enough. And from that place, everything else becomes lighter. Because you are no longer searching for something outside of you to confirm what has always been within. And as you begin to stand in that place where your worth no longer depends on being chosen, something else becomes easier to see. Not every ending arrives with a clear reason. Not every distance is caused by conflict. Some things do not break, they simply fade, and when they do, the mind does not always know what to do with it. There are endings that do not come with arguments, no final words, no clear moment where everything changes. No visible line between what was and what is no longer. Just a slow shift. A conversation that becomes less frequent. A connection that feels quieter each time. A presence that is no longer as strong as it once was. And before you can fully name it, something has already changed. There is a unique kind of confusion in these endings, because nothing seems wrong. There was no clear mistake, no obvious conflict, no moment that explains why things are different. And without that clarity, the mind begins to search. It looks for reasons. Did I miss something? Did something happen that I did not see? Is there something I should have done differently? Because when something ends without conflict, it feels incomplete. It feels like a story without a final scene. And the mind does not like unfinished stories. It wants something to point to, a reason that makes sense, a moment that explains everything, a clear understanding of what changed. But sometimes there is none. Sometimes a relationship does not end because something went wrong. It ends because something shifted. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually. Two people begin to move in different directions, not in a way that creates tension, but in a way that creates distance. And that distance grows quietly, without resistance, without conflict, without the need for a final moment. This can feel strange, because you may still care, you may still remember what the connection once was. You may still feel a sense of appreciation for what existed. But at the same time, you recognize that it is no longer the same, and holding on to what it was does not bring it back. This is where acceptance becomes important. Not acceptance of loss in the traditional sense, but acceptance of change, of the fact that not everything is meant to last in the same way forever, that some connections exist for a period of time, and then naturally come to an end, without needing to be broken, without needing to be explained. This kind of ending requires a different kind of understanding, because there is nothing to resolve, no conflict to process, no clear reason to hold on to, only a quiet awareness that something has run its course. And this awareness can be difficult to sit with, because it leaves you without a clear conclusion. It leaves you with a feeling instead of an answer, and that feeling can be subtle. A sense of distance, a recognition that something is no longer active, a quiet knowing that the connection has shifted beyond what it once was. At first, there may be a tendency to resist this, to try to bring things back, to recreate the connection, to find a way to return to what once felt natural. But this effort often leads to more discomfort, because you are trying to revive something that has already changed, not out of neglect, not out of failure, but out of natural movement. There is also a tendency to question yourself, to wonder if you are letting go too easily, if you should try harder, if you should reach out more, say more, do more. But sometimes the absence of effort is not a mistake. It is a reflection of what is already happening. When a connection is no longer active, forcing it does not bring it back. It only creates tension where there was once ease. And this is where detachment becomes quiet. Not a decision made in a single moment, but a gradual acceptance of what is already unfolding. You begin to stop forcing interaction. You allow the silence to remain. You accept the distance without trying to close it. And in doing so, something softens. The need to define the ending fades. The urge to find a clear reason begins to settle. You begin to understand that not all endings need to be understood in the same way. Some are meant to be felt, not analyzed, not explained, just acknowledged. There is also a quiet respect that comes with this, for the connection that once existed, for the role it played in your life, for the time it was present, without needing to hold on to it beyond its natural course. You do not have to turn it into something negative. You do not have to create a story around why it ended. You can simply recognize that it was, and now it is not in the same way. And that is enough. This perspective brings a different kind of peace, because you are no longer trying to turn a quiet ending into something dramatic. You are not searching for a reason that may not exist. You are not creating tension where there is none. You are simply allowing what has already changed to be what it is. There is also a deeper understanding that forms here, that relationships are not always meant to stay in the same form, that connection is not always permanent, that people move, grow, shift in ways that do not always align over time. And this is not something to resist. It is something to recognize, because holding on to a connection that has naturally faded creates a different kind of distance, a distance from reality, a tension between what is and what you wish it still was. And releasing that tension allows you to return to the present, to what is actually here, instead of what has already passed. There is also a quiet maturity in accepting these kinds of endings, because it requires you to let go without a clear reason, to move forward without a defined conclusion, to trust that not everything needs to be resolved in order to be complete. And this trust changes the way you experience connection. You begin to appreciate what is present without attaching to how long it will last. You engage without needing permanence. You connect without trying to hold on beyond what feels natural. And this creates a different kind of freedom, a freedom that allows relationships to exist without pressure, without expectation, without the need to define them in fixed ways. Because you understand that everything moves, everything changes, everything has its own rhythm. And when that rhythm shifts, you do not resist it. You follow it, not with force, not with urgency, but with awareness. And in that awareness, there is peace. A peace that comes from allowing things to end quietly, without needing to turn them into something more, without needing to hold on to what has already softened, without needing to create meaning where there is simply change. And as you continue to move in this way, something becomes clear. That not all endings are losses, some are completions, not loud, not dramatic, but complete in their own way. A chapter that closes without needing a final sentence. A connection that fades without needing to be broken. A presence that shifts without needing to disappear completely. And in recognizing this, you begin to feel something different, a sense of ease, a sense that you are no longer in conflict with what is changing, a sense that you can allow things to move without needing to control how they end. And in that allowing, there is a quiet kind of peace, not created, not forced, but revealed, in the space where you stop trying to define every ending, and simply let it be what it is. A quiet transition, a gentle shift, a natural completion. And in that completion, you continue forward, not carrying the weight of what has already ended, but moving with the lightness of what has been released. And as those quiet endings settle, as connections fade without noise and stories close without a final scene, something begins to open in their place. At first, it may not feel like something new. It may not feel like relief. It can feel like something has been taken away, leaving behind a space that feels unfamiliar. A space that once was filled. A space that now feels empty. And the mind, not used to this kind of stillness, begins to question it. When everything slows down, something unexpected appears. Not chaos, not confusion, but silence. A kind of emotional quiet that feels different from anything before. The noise that once filled your inner world, the constant pull of attachments, the weight of unresolved thoughts, the presence of connections that demanded your attention, all begin to fall away. And what remains is space. At first, this space can feel uncomfortable because it is unfamiliar. You may notice the absence of things you once carried, the absence of constant thinking, the absence of emotional tension, the absence of the pull toward people, situations, or outcomes that once occupied your mind. And without those things, there can be a feeling that something is missing, not in a dramatic way, but in a subtle way. A quiet sense that there is nothing to hold on to. The mind may interpret this as emptiness, and for a moment, it may feel like loss, because you are used to being filled with thoughts, with emotions, with attachments, with movement. And when that filling disappears, the space it leaves behind can feel like absence. But this is where perception begins to shift, because what feels like emptiness is not a lack. It is openness. It is the removal of what was once occupying your attention. It is the clearing of what no longer belongs. And this clearing creates something important. Not a void, but potential. The mind often resists this, because it is conditioned to seek stimulation, to fill space as quickly as possible, to replace what has been removed with something else, a new distraction, a new attachment, a new source of engagement. Because being in open space can feel uncertain. There is nothing to focus on in the same way, nothing pulling you in a specific direction, nothing demanding your attention. And without that, there is a moment of stillness, a pause, and this pause can feel unfamiliar, but within it, something begins to grow, not immediately visible, not clearly defined, but present, a subtle sense of clarity, a quiet awareness, a deeper connection to what is actually here, without the layers of noise that once covered it. This is the beginning of understanding space differently. Not as something empty, but as something alive, a place where new awareness can emerge, a place where your mind is no longer crowded, a place where your energy is no longer scattered. And in that place, you begin to notice things you did not notice before. Your thoughts become clearer, not because there are more of them, but because there are fewer. Your emotions feel lighter, not because they are gone, but because they are not being constantly stirred. Your presence becomes stronger, not because you are trying to focus, but because there is less pulling you away. This is what happens when emotional clutter clears. What once felt normal, the constant engagement, the continuous movement, the endless cycles of thought and reaction, begins to fade. And what replaces it is simplicity, a kind of inner quiet that does not need to be filled. There is also a shift in how you experience time. Without constant mental activity, moments feel different, slower, more open, less rushed. You are no longer moving from one thought to another without pause. You are able to remain in a single moment without feeling the need to escape it. And this creates a deeper sense of presence, not forced, not practiced, but natural, because there is space for it. There is also a different relationship with yourself that begins to form. Without the noise of constant thought, you begin to see yourself more clearly, not through the lens of past experiences, not through the weight of attachments, but as you are now. And this clarity can feel new, because it is not shaped by external influence. It is not filtered through the expectations you once carried. It is simply awareness, a direct experience of being. And in that awareness, there is a quiet sense of stability. Not something you hold on to, but something that exists when there is nothing pulling you away. This is why space is important, because it allows you to return to yourself, not the version shaped by attachments, not the identity built through roles and expectations, but the part of you that exists beneath all of that, the part that does not need to be filled, the part that is already complete. There is also creativity that begins to emerge in this space, not necessarily in the form of action, but in the form of possibility. When your mind is not occupied with constant repetition, it becomes open to new ideas, open to new perspectives, open to ways of seeing that were not available when everything was crowded. This openness is subtle. It does not rush. It does not demand attention. But it is there, waiting to be noticed. And as you begin to trust this space, something shifts. The discomfort begins to fade. The need to fill it becomes less urgent. You begin to see that nothing is missing. That what felt like emptiness was actually the removal of what was unnecessary. And in that removal, there is freedom. Freedom from constant thinking, freedom from emotional weight, freedom from the need to always be engaged with something. And in that freedom, there is peace. A peace that does not come from adding more, but from having less noise, less pressure, less attachment. This peace is quiet. It does not announce itself. It does not demand recognition. It is simply there, in the background, in the stillness, in the space that once felt empty. And as you continue to move in this way, something becomes clear. That space is not something to fear. It is something to trust, because it is in space that growth happens, not forced growth, not structured change, but natural unfolding, the kind that cannot happen when everything is filled, the kind that requires openness. And in that openness, something new begins to take shape. Not immediately, not in a way that can be clearly defined, but gradually, a deeper understanding, a stronger sense of presence, a clearer connection to what matters. And this unfolding does not need to be controlled. It does not need to be directed. It simply happens when you allow space to remain. There is also a quiet realization that forms here, that you do not need to constantly seek something to feel complete, that the absence of noise is not a problem, that stillness is not something to escape, it is something to experience. And in that experience, you begin to feel whole in a different way, not through accumulation, not through attachment, but through simplicity, through being, through allowing. And as this understanding deepens, the fear of emptiness disappears, because you no longer see it as emptiness, you see it as space. And in that space, there is life, not loud, not overwhelming, but steady, present, enough. And in that enoughness, there is a quiet kind of fulfillment, one that does not depend on constant activity, one that does not require external input, one that exists simply because you are no longer filling what does not need to be filled. And in that realization, something settles, a calm, a clarity, a sense that you are no longer searching for something to complete you, because nothing is missing. There is only space, and in that space, everything you need begins to emerge, naturally, quietly, without force. And in that quiet emergence, there is peace, not something you create, but something you uncover, once the clutter is gone and the space is allowed to remain. And as that space becomes familiar, as the silence no longer feels like something to escape, another pattern begins to reveal itself. Even in the quiet, even in the openness, there can still be a subtle urge moving beneath the surface, a quiet impulse to step in, to adjust, to repair what does not feel right. Because when the noise fades, what remains can feel imperfect, and the mind wants to fix it. There is a deep instinct within you to repair what feels broken, not always loudly, not always with urgency, but consistently. A quiet pull to make things better, to correct what seems off, to bring everything into a state that feels complete, stable, resolved. It can show up in many ways, trying to fix how someone feels, trying to correct every uncomfortable emotion within yourself, trying to adjust situations so they match your idea of how they should be. And underneath all of it, there is a belief that things must be fixed in order to be okay. That discomfort is a problem. That imperfection is something to be corrected. That anything that feels incomplete needs intervention. This belief is not always obvious. It is often hidden in good intentions, in care, in responsibility, in the desire to improve, to help, to grow. But even within these intentions, there can be tension. Because the need to fix does not come from acceptance. It comes from resistance. A resistance to what is. A feeling that the present moment is not enough as it is, and this resistance creates movement. The mind begins to search for solutions, to identify what is wrong, to figure out how to change it, to move away from what feels uncomfortable. But not everything that feels uncomfortable is broken. Not everything that feels incomplete needs to be completed. Not everything that appears imperfect requires correction. This is where a deeper form of detachment begins, not from effort, not from growth, but from the compulsion to intervene in everything that does not feel right. There is a difference between responding and reacting. Responding comes from clarity. It is intentional. It is aligned with what is needed. Reacting comes from discomfort. It is immediate. It is driven by the need to escape what feels wrong. The urge to fix often comes from reaction, from the inability to sit with imperfection, from the discomfort of allowing things to be as they are. This can be especially strong when it comes to your own emotions. When something within you feels unsettled, the mind quickly tries to change it, to distract, to analyze, to find a way out of the feeling, because staying with it feels difficult. But what if the feeling is not something to fix? What if it is something to experience, not forever, not as something you hold on to, but as something you allow to pass through, without immediate intervention? This changes the way you relate to yourself. You begin to notice your emotions without rushing to change them. You allow discomfort without labeling it as a problem. You sit with what arises without trying to force it into something else. And in that allowing, something shifts. The intensity begins to soften. The need to fix begins to fade. The feeling moves naturally without being held in place by resistance. This same pattern exists in how you relate to others. The desire to fix people, to help them change, to guide them toward what you believe is better. This can come from care, from wanting to support, from wanting to see them well. But it can also come from discomfort, from not being able to accept them as they are, from feeling that something about them needs to be different. And this creates tension, because people do not change when they are forced, they change when they are ready. And trying to fix them before that point often leads to frustration. Not because your intention is wrong, but because the timing is not aligned. This is where letting go becomes important, not of care, but of control, of the belief that you must be the one to create change, that you must be the one to fix what feels broken, because not everything is yours to fix. Some things need to unfold on their own. Some things need space, not intervention. Some things need acceptance, not correction. There is also a deeper layer to this. The idea that something being imperfect means it is not enough. This belief can shape how you see your life. You may feel that until everything is in order, you cannot rest, Until everything is resolved, you cannot feel at peace. Until everything is fixed, you cannot fully relax into the present. But this creates an endless cycle, because there will always be something that feels incomplete, something that could be improved, something that does not fully match your expectation. And if your peace depends on everything being fixed, it will always feel just out of reach. This is why acceptance is essential, not as giving up, not as ignoring what can be improved, but as recognizing that perfection is not required for peace, that things can be as they are and still be okay, that you can exist within imperfection without needing to change it immediately. This does not mean you stop growing. It does not mean you stop taking action. It means your actions come from clarity, not from discomfort, from intention, not from urgency, from understanding, not from resistance. You begin to act because it feels aligned, not because you feel pressured to fix something. And this changes the energy behind everything you do. There is less tension, less urgency, less force. There is more patience, more presence, more trust. Trust that not everything needs to be controlled, that not everything needs to be corrected, that life does not have to be perfect in order to be meaningful. There is also a quiet relief that comes with this. A release from the constant need to monitor, adjust, and improve every aspect of your experience. A sense that you can step back, that you can allow things to exist without constantly intervening. And in that stepping back, something becomes visible. That many things resolve themselves when they are not forced. That clarity often emerges when you stop trying to create it. That balance returns when you stop trying to control it. This is the natural movement of life. Not rigid, not fixed, but fluid. And when you align with that movement, you begin to feel more at ease. Less like you are managing everything. More like you are part of something that is already unfolding. There is also a deeper understanding of yourself that begins to form. You see that your need to fix was not wrong. It was a response, a way of trying to create stability, a way of trying to feel in control. But now, you no longer need that in the same way. Because you trust more. You trust the process. You trust your ability to respond when needed. You trust that not everything requires immediate action. And this trust creates a different kind of strength. Not the strength of control, but the strength of allowing, of knowing when to act and when to step back, of being able to sit within